So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're taking a look at Dr. Jennifer Hall Rivera. She is the Director for Educational Programs for Answers in Genesis. While her bio on Answers in Genesis indicates her interest in forensic science, which is ironic, as we'll see, the only education I can find for her is a doctorate in education from Liberty University. Liberty University is indeed accredited, but it's also the school that uncritically embraced the Orange Man, starting with his candidacy all the way through his presidency, despite the fact that if he were a student there, he would be expelled for violating their code of conduct, which prohibits any sexual activity outside of a monogamous heterosexual marriage and the use of foul language. The talk we're looking at is called Science Will Never Be Able to Explain This, but the Bible can. Well, let's see what she's got for us.
Today we're going to be taking a look at a presentation that I have titled, Is Science or the Bible Right About Origins?
Well, that depends entirely on what you mean. The scientific conclusions we have reached about various topics to do with the origin of various aspects of the natural world can be used to make predictions about future data, including things like what drugs will help with what infections. On the other hand, there are many open questions about which science can't really be right or wrong, since there's no claim to be made on the basis of science in those areas. As for the Bible, the basic claim that a God created everything, in some sense, isn't really open to scientific investigation. However, the story of a special creation of life, the instantaneous formation of the Earth, Moon, and stars a few thousand years ago, and a global flood a bit more recently than that, is flatly not true, and is contradicted by both literal and metaphorical mountains of evidence.
So today we'll be looking at, well, what is that word science? What does it mean? What are its origins?
I actually think that that's a good question to ask. If we don't know what science is in the first place, then how can we know whether what we're talking about is science, or how we can answer the question of whether science is right about a particular thing or not? For me, science is a method of investigating the natural world in which the basic assumption is made that the way the universe operates naturally does not change across space and time. In other words, the world works the same way in my kitchen as it does inside a Japanese volcano, and the recipe that made a cake 2 days ago will work 2 days hence. Science is based on the collection and analysis of empirical data through a combination of observation and experiment, and these data are then used to create hypotheses which can be tested through the generation of predictions based on the hypotheses and the collection of future data to see if the predictions were accurate or not. Enough of these hypotheses that are related to each other, and all shown to be well supported by evidence, can be collected into a scientific theory, an overarching framework to explain large amounts of otherwise disparate and uncorrelated data. I wonder what Dr. Hall Rivera will say about what science is.
And as well as, what can science measure and not measure? And that's exactly what we're going to see today, is that science, there's some things it just cannot do.
This is indeed true. Like all human endeavors, science is limited, and there are some things, such as proving or disproving God, or giving you the answer to questions like, what is the good, and giving reasons why one ought to have virtue, that it can't do.
And then finally, we'll take a look at, well, is science or the Bible right about our origins?
The part I look forward to most.
Now, if we take a look at that word science, and what does it actually mean? Well, that word science means knowledge, and science is knowledge gained through learning and application.
See, I don't much like that definition. For one thing, to me, knowledge is justified true belief, which is just the standard definition. And while science can provide knowledge, saying that it is itself knowledge seems like a category error to me. Plus, the phrase learning and application seems so broad as to be wide enough to fit a crab-like cargo ship through.
Now, if I were to ask you to define the word science or describe what you imagine when you hear that word science, you would probably describe someone working in a lab, designing a hypothesis and an experiment, running that experiment, taking those results, and most importantly, being able to replicate that experiment.
No, I probably wouldn't, and that's because many of the sciences I'm most interested in spend a lot of time not in labs doing experiments, but in the field taking samples or observations. An experiment doesn't need to be in a lab to be performed. It can be as simple as G. Based on my hypothesis, if I point a telescope at point X in the sky, I should see Y. I don't have a third-grade understanding of what science is.
And that's, what we associate with science, and we call that the scientific method.
Different sciences have different versions of the scientific method, and while what Dr. Hall Rivera is describing certainly correlates to the scientific method in many cases, it's not all of them. I suspect she is doing this in order to falsely claim that instances of science following different methods, like paleontology, are illegitimate.
But what about evidence that's unobservable in its original form? What if we can't directly test something?
That's easy. You use your knowledge of how the universe operates to predict what causes of current conditions are plausible. Then you conduct observations or experiments involving those causes and see if you get results that match the present conditions whose past causes you're investigating. If they do, then congratulations, your hypothesis has gained scientific support. If not, then it's time to go back and figure something else out. You'd think as someone who was involved in forensics, a science all about investigating the past without the benefit of any observers who were present, and yet still coming to conclusions that stand up not just in scientific papers but also in court, Dr. Hall Rivera might know this.
Well, that falls on under another umbrella, as we call it, and we call that historical science.
There is no strong distinction between these largely imaginary categories. Remember, all observations are in the past once they are made, and since the basic assumption that empiricism is based on is that the universe operates according to invariant principles across time and space, there is no reason to draw this distinction. Sure, you can draw it if you like, but it is either a distinction without a difference, or to make a difference you have to violate the one thing that makes empiricism valuable in the first place, the ability to use past data to predict the future, which requires that assumption. If you want to claim that historical science is a fundamentally different thing than operational science, you can only do so by rejecting science as a whole. Curiously, that does seem to be the way Answers in Genesis tends to go, even if they keep that part quiet.
So fundamentally, there are really two types of science. There's observational science, and there is historical science. So once again, observational science, sometimes called operational science, is when we can use our five senses.
Oh, so I guess radio astronomy doesn't count, since humans can't directly detect radio waves. Gee, that seems stupid.
We're directly observing, possibly tasting, smelling, right? We can record that phenomenon, and we can verify it, and we can, most importantly, repeat it.
Curiously, all things that can be done with things like paleontology and geology, which Answers in Genesis tends to lump into historical science.
But this is distinctly different from evidence of the past, when we're looking at something unobservable in its original form.
Literally everything is unobservable in its original form, because everything is part of a chain of causality and change that goes back to the first moments of the universe. If this is a problem for the fossils, it's a problem for Jennifer's forensics, and a problem for modern physics labs, etc. For someone trying to distinguish two things, Dr. Hall Rivera really seems to be failing at pointing out actual differences between them. Maybe that's why real scientists tend not to make this arbitrary distinction.
So if you take a look at this fossil here, was anyone there to record the exact process of this fossilization?
No, no one was. That's why we do things like experiments in deposition and taphonomy to figure out how fossils can form and how the rock matrix around them can form. And then, when someone proposes an explanation of how they formed as physically impossible, based on those experiments, such as a global flood, they are rightly laughed out of the room for being complete lunatics.
No one was there to record how long it took, the exact date and time when it occurred, the processes that were involved in creating this fossilization. No one was there to see it. So when we look at evidence from the past, like fossils, we then have to apply some interpretation to that.
Not in any unique way, no. We need to look at the data. That's what science does. If you have an interpretation that says global flood, well, then we can look at the physics of water and sediment to see if it's a plausible explanation. It turns out we did do that, and we did like 150 years ago. It didn't turn out well for the idea of a global flood. Hence, it is rejected. Literature, like the Bible, can be open to multiple interpretations, all of which can be held in good faith. Empirical data is not so flexible, and most interpretations can in fact be quite confidently excluded. If you have a fossil in stone that we have no way of explaining through a flood, and you want to say a flood did it, it's on you to do the experiments with deposition tanks to show that it's even possible. Till then, whining about different interpretations is just a dishonest tactic designed to get sympathy, since you can't get science on your side.
Right? We have to have some assumptions involved in that.
Yes, the assumption that the universe doesn't just arbitrarily change how it works.
And that is largely influenced by a scientist's worldview. And this is why we may get two different conclusions on the date of a fossil, because no one was there to see it. So we have to put some assumptions into that analysis.
Yeah, there's the scientific assumption that I've been talking about that gives us real answers that we can use to predict future data. Then there's the assumption that a particular internally inconsistent hermeneutic of a particular collection of literature has to be true no matter what. That gives us either no predictions or predictions that turn out to be false. That's the one Answers in Genesis goes with. Can you figure out why they're not taken seriously by actual academics in the fields with which they take issue?
So once again, observational science, we're using the scientific method. Scientific method is only possible, it's important to realize it's only possible to make predictions and test those predictions because God created an orderly universe where we can do that. So the scientific method is only possible because we have a creator God.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
Since we have no universes we can check but this one, and we can't even conclusively verify that anyone created this one, there's no way to make that prediction other than just making unwarranted assumptions. Perhaps order is simply a fundamental part of reality, because in order for reality to be real, it must be self-consistent. That's at least a possibility. The only assumption needed to say that the universe is consistent is the assumption that it is. Going any farther isn't part of science, although I can't say that you're not allowed to do so. You certainly aren't allowed to do it in science, though. Any metaphysical conclusions that you reach about such things are not inside the scope of science.
And this is distinctly different from origins or historical science.
Nope, because if the universe works in a consistent way like Jen here just said it does, then investigating the past is ultimately no different than investigating the future, which is ultimately what her precious observational science does. Just on her own terms, she has debunked her own idea about the difference between so-called historical and observational science.
So if you look at the example here, what you see is the famous Lucy fossil, as we call it, and we do have a copy of this on display here at the Creation Museum. Make sure you take time to go through there and check that out. But when we take a look at this fossil, because of where this fossil was discovered, because of additional fossil evidence that was related back to this individual species, based on scientists' interpretation and worldview, they are going to come to two completely different conclusions about what that fossil was when it was alive. Because remember, we're looking at evidence from the past.
It sure would be nice if she went into what those conclusions were, but since on screen she had two different people thinking about what they were looking at, and one was thinking about a reasonable reconstruction of Australopithecus afarensis, and the other one was thinking about a subadult chimpanzee, let's talk about that. So first, we know that Lucy had an inline toe despite not having her feet, and that's because not only do we have footprints of the right size in the right place, but we also have other fossils of Australopithecus afarensis feet. Second, we know that Lucy could not have been a knuckle walker because her hip was fundamentally unsuited to it. Also, the angle at which she would have had to hold her femur relative to her lower legs would have made quadrupedal motion awkward at best, but it's perfectly adapted for allowing her to stay balanced while having only one leg in contact with the ground, just like what we observe in modern humans. Further, we don't have Lucy's foramen magnum. Just like with her feet, we have the foramina magna of other members of her species, and they are at the bottom, not the back of the skull, like in a chimpanzee. That means for her to look forward rather than down when on all fours, she had to crane her neck up, like a modern human who's crawling on all fours has to. Altogether, this means that based on that whole thing where the universe works in a consistent way, like Dr. Hall Rivera has already said it does, then Lucy could not have been a chimpanzee or any other kind of quadrupedal ape. She was definitively a biped with essentially all the same adaptations to bipedal locomotion as are found in modern humans, although there are still some distinctions, which is also why the Laetoli footprints, which are the footprints left by her conspecifics, have some differences from a footprint that could have been left by a Homo sapiens.
Unobservable in its original form. So when we find bones, and when they found Lucy, only 47 of the 206 bones needed for identification were discovered.
Fun fact, apes are bilaterally symmetrical, so if you find 47 of the 206 bones, you've basically found 94 bones. And further, it's absolutely absurd to think you need all 206 bones to identify a skeleton. And the thing is, Dr. Hall Rivera here absolutely knows this because she's done forensics. No one is going to say that if you find a skeleton but it's missing a few ribs, one side of the hip, and some hand and foot bones, that you can't identify that skeleton. In modern situations, that's often more than enough to identify the skeleton to a single individual, even without DNA analysis. And it's way, way more than enough to identify what species the individual belonged to.
The hands and foot bones were largely missing.
That's true. Good thing Lucy isn't the only specimen of Australopithecus afarensis ever discovered, isn't it?
So, they're always looking for that missing link, are they?
I mean, the more the better, but also...
And because they found additional what they call species fossils.
That is a made-up term. All I can think of is that she means they found other fossils of the same species as Lucy, which is true. Is she going to deny that Australopithecus afarensis is a valid taxon?
They found a single jawbone that they actually linked back to the Lucy fossil, but it was 1,000 miles away.
No, they didn't. No one has ever claimed that a jawbone found 1,000 miles from Lucy was her jawbone. Jen is just lying here, and this is where I stop using the title doctor with her. Obviously, she's outside her field, and that's okay. You're allowed to go outside your field. Heck, I'm doing that in every video I make. Since if I have a field, it's definitely not this. But when you do that, you need to be extra careful. You need to double check your sources. Consult with actual people in that field. Otherwise, you're just talking out of your anus. Hac annus ex annus suo loquitur.
And in that same fossil layer where they found this jawbone, they found some fossilized footprints that were very clearly made from something that was upright walking. We could see a heel-toe strike. We call those the Laetoli footprints. We also have a copy of those on display in our Lucy exhibit here because they're so closely interconnected.
I mean, they're connected in that they were seemingly made by the same species. They're the wrong size, and the footfall was wrong for them to be made by modern humans, and the only known bipedal ape around at the time was Australopithecus afarensis. And they are consistent with the foot morphology of those A. afarensis individuals where foot bones have been found. But they certainly were not made by Lucy herself.
That they said this must be, right, this fossil must be the upright walking ancestor of humans.
Well, Lucy was absolutely an upright walking ape who was more closely related to modern humans than to any other extant ape. She herself, just from a statistical standpoint, almost certainly left no living descendants, and it's not clear if her species is itself directly ancestral to Homo sapiens. But that's not really the point. She represents the morphology one would only expect if the theory of evolution were true and humans were in fact apes with common ancestry shared with other apes. Most species are a part of a group of closely related species. Those isolated and monospecific families of animals like Orycteropodidae, the aardvarks, are the exception, not the rule. Generally, when a fossil is found, you can infer that there were at least a handful of other species in the same genus in various places at the same time that the specimen you found was alive. This is true for Australopithecus afarensis, and while it may not have been the exact species that gave rise to modern humans, it was certainly one like it that did, and the only reason to think that such a perfect transition between basal Miocene apes and modern humans should even exist in the first place is that evolution is true. No creationist predicted finding anything we could reasonably call a human ancestor, even in the broad sense of karyotypical of the actual ancestor of humans, with such a perfect intermediate anatomy. This is a confirmed prediction of evolution, one of hundreds of thousands. So far, the only creationist prediction that came true that I can think of is that the universe isn't eternal. But then, that was confirmed via the Big Bang, which this brand of creationists reject anyway, even though it's basically the only scientific win creationism of any brand has ever had based on the ideas distinctive to creationism.
Of course, they found some additional fossils that we link back to that Lucy species, very clearly showing us that she is nothing more than an extinct primate.
Well, of course she's an extinct primate. Humans are primates. Their ancestors, from the first primates on, are all of logical necessity going to be extinct primates. This is like saying that Lucy is just an extinct vertebrate, as if humans didn't have a spine. But maybe you're not convinced that humans are primates, so let's go through the way you know that a primate is one. First, we have dexterous hands, or mani, fully enclosed orbits, a flexible shoulder joint, an enlarged brain case, and flat nails rather than claws at the end of the digits on both the foot, or pes, and the hand, or manus. What do you know? Humans meet all those criteria. When humans go extinct, they too will be extinct primates.
Which is how we have Lucy portrayed here at the Creation Museum. She is just a primate, she is extinct, and we can clearly see that from the fossil evidence.
Well, technically this is true. They do depict Lucy as an extinct primate, but so does every real museum with a Lucy display and every paper about her. The difference, though, is that while the Creation Museum shows her in an anatomically impossible stance, as a knuckle-walking quadruped, other museums correctly have her as a biped. Lucy would be no more comfortable in life walking on her knuckles than would a modern human. She has every adaptation to bipedality, from the shape of her pelvis to the valgus knee to the inline big toe to the ventral foramen magnum.
But we can see how when we look at evidence,
Something I'm not seeing any reason to think Jen has ever done.
we can come to two different conclusions, and I like to equate that to the court of law. As a forensic scientist, we used to collect evidence at crime scenes. Of course, remember, when I used to go to a crime scene, I didn't see that crime occur, so I'm arriving onto an event that's now in the past.
And if she's being consistent, when she arrives at a crime scene, she's already decided that she knows what happened. Then she forces any of the evidence that she can to fit into that story and just ignores all the evidence that doesn't fit it. Because here's the thing. Forensic scientists actually do come to conclusions based on the evidence. Lawyers, though, actually do walk into a courtroom ready to say what happened regardless of the evidence stacked against them. And that's because the court is necessarily an adversarial place. Both sides want to win more than either side wants to get to the truth. That's why police will lie to suspects and use psychological tricks to extract confessions, even though we know that these techniques lead to such confessions. And then those confessions will be used in court to demonstrate the guilt of the falsely accused. If you don't believe me, then I encourage you to look into the Innocence Project, which has helped free hundreds of wrongly convicted persons, many of whom confessed to crimes they never committed, after on average 16 hours of intense and psychologically grueling interrogation. On the other hand, defense lawyers will do anything they can to get someone who is in fact guilty off as lightly or completely as possible. They will get evidence thrown out, they will delay trials, call into question testimony when there is in fact no indication of unreliability, and will defend the absolute scum of the earth. Science, on the other hand, while it does have rivalries and people have their pet hypotheses, is about trying to eliminate as much incorrect thinking as possible in the hopes that what remains is reasonably close to the truth about whatever subject is under investigation. As a rule, scientists do not come to questions with conclusions already in mind. Instead, they see what the evidence says. Now, that's not to say that no scientist ever jumps to an unwarranted conclusion or that science is free from bias. Far from it. But the goal of science is to reach a consensus based on evidence regardless of what that consensus ends up being, so long as it is well supported. That's not even a thought in the minds of opposing lawyers. They know which position they're taking, and they don't particularly care about convincing anyone but the triers of facts, such as the judge and jury members.
Looking at evidence as unobservable in its original form. And when you present it to a jury, it's the same situation, right? They're looking at evidence unobservable in its original form, so their assumptions, right, their interpretations are very much involved in their decisions.
Yeah, and they are non-experts who verifiably come to the wrong conclusion in many cases. I mean, look at one of the more famous cases in the recent history of the United States. O.J. Simpson verifiably murdered both Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman. He was acquitted despite DNA and other forensic evidence. That was the wrong decision. That's why science doesn't use the same system as courts. It's also why there's nothing like double jeopardy in science. You can try and retry a conclusion as many times as you like in science. Nothing, not even evolution or universal gravitation, are immune to a new trial in which if the evidence goes against them, they could be tossed out. This whole courtroom comparison is seemingly just an attempt to convince the audience that science is in fact a caricature of itself, where the evidence can point wherever you want it to. You just need to put your own worldview in. Unfortunately for Jen here, and fortunately for the human race, that isn't how science works, and the evidence is absolutely incompatible with most conclusions, and compatible with only a narrow range of options. Indeed, that's the whole point of the development of things like statistical significance testing, to eliminate unreasonable interpretations of data, and it does a good job of it too.
So you can have a jury who's going to come to two different conclusions. Half the jury may say guilty, and the other half may say, no, this suspect is not guilty, because it is unobservable.
No, even when it's observable, juries can come to the wrong conclusion. That's again why science doesn't use any system that even remotely resembles a trial setup in determining what the conclusions and consensus in a given field are.
So if we take a look at that word science, what I think is pretty fascinating is we're going to see how the very definition of science has changed throughout history.
A creationist discovers that semantic drift is a thing. I wonder if that means that we'll get an actual treatment for historical linguistics from a creationist. That would be interesting. The most I've ever seen is Bodhi Hodge just saying vaguely that language families originated at the Tower of Babel, even though he doesn't say how far back in language families he's going, nor does he bother confronting the fact that we can figure out the Heimat or homeland of various major language families, and only Afroasiatic could even plausibly be located in the area of the setting of the Tower of Babel story. Of course, I don't actually think we'll get that, since none of that is as sexy as dinosaurs fighting knights, or the biggest act of global genocide imaginable. Still, a dinosaur can dream, can't he?
And if we go back to 1828, we can take a look at Webster's dictionary, and they actually defined science as knowledge, and they say the science of God must be perfect, right? They still included God in that definition.
Fun fact, dictionaries are descriptive, not proscriptive. They tell you how a word is used by a broad segment of the speaking population of a particular language or dialect in the few years preceding publication. You cannot use a dictionary to argue anything other than common usage. It doesn't tell you what words ought to mean. This definition of science isn't right or wrong. It simply reflects the use of the word by English speakers in the United States in the 1820s. Here's another thing. Near as I can tell, Jen is just lying about that definition. The part about God's science being perfect is not part of the definition. It's an example sentence. Every definition in the 1828 Webster's Dictionary is followed by an example of use. Now, the formatting is not as clear in the year 1828 edition as in later editions, but you can see this in other definitions, such as definition 3, which reads, art derived from precepts or built upon principles. Science perfects genius. Clearly, the last 3 words are a declarative sentence that is not the definition. In fact, no definition for science in the 1828 Webster's Dictionary includes any mention of God. That word only appears in the example sentence for the first definition.
But now if we go forward to 1913 Webster's Dictionary, we can see something significant has happened. We see that God is no longer in the definition of science, and what have they replaced him with? Natural science.
Well, God was never in the definition in 1828, so that's just a lie. But also, this definition is included in the 1828 second definition for science, which includes, quote, subjects founded on generally acknowledged truths as metaphysics or on experiment and observation, as chemistry and natural philosophy, end quote.
Well, what happened between 1828 and 1913?
Andrew Jackson became the 7th President of the United States. King George IV of England died and was succeeded by William IV. Leopold I of Belgium was coronated. Greece gained independence from the Ottoman Empire. Britain abolished the slave trade in their territories. The Syrian revolt in the Ottoman Empire. Andrew Jackson survived an assassination attempt. The Battle of the Alamo, the Galilee earthquake, the telegraph was invented. The moon was photographed for the first time. The California Gold Rush. The Opium Wars, the first Afghan War. The first Roman Catholic governor in the United States was elected in Maine. The Dominican Republic separated from Haiti. The U.S. Congress bypassed a presidential veto for the first time. The Mexican-American War. The revolver was invented. Joseph Jenkins Roberts became the first president of an independent Liberia. The Hungarian-Transylvanian army defeated the Russian-Austrian army without the help of vampires. The first America's Cup yacht race was sailed. Moby Dick was published. The grooved rail was invented, making trains safer. Buenos Aires became an independent state, then wasn't anymore. The Republican Party was formed. Ottawa became an incorporated city. Tasmania became the first place in the world to have elections by way of a secret ballot by law. The Dred Scott decision, the Marian apparitions of Lords, France. Oregon became a state in the USA. Vladivostok was founded. The American Civil War. Sirius B, a white dwarf star, was discovered. The Swiss village of Ticino was partially destroyed by an avalanche. The Danish-Prussian War. The Matterhorn was climbed for the first time in history. Maronite Christians defeated Ottoman troops in what's now Lebanon. The first elevated railways was completed. The Abyssinian War. The American Museum of Natural History was founded. The Japanese yen was introduced. The Ku Klux Klan Act was passed in the USA, an act under which the 45th president would eventually be charged. Mormonism became a thing. Japan adopted the Gregorian calendar. The King of Hawaii visited the United States, the first king to do so. The SS Deutschland ran aground, resulting in the death of 157 people. The telephone was invented. Swan Lake debuted in Moscow. The Russo-Turkish War, the gold standard, was dropped in the USA and readopted. The Anglo-Egyptian War, the Pacific War between Peru and Chile. British-occupied Ireland had habeas corpus suspended. The first commercial power plant came online. Liquid oxygen was made for the first time. The invention of the 8-hour workday. The first successful appendectomy was performed. Spain abolished Cuban slavery. The rabies vaccine was developed. The National Geographic Society was founded. Nintendo was founded as a playing card manufacturer. Everything about Vincent van Gogh. Alternating current was first transmitted over a long distance. The Pinkertons murdered a bunch of people. The diesel engine was invented. Korea experienced a peasant revolt. The first portable handheld electric drill was invented. X-ray imaging was invented. The electric bicycle was invented. New York City annexed a bunch of land and became the second largest city by geographical area. The first wireless distress signal from a ship was sent. The Boxer Rebellion. Australia gained independence. 115 people were killed in the Shiloh Baptist Church disaster, which was a stampede of humans. The first silent film was made. Work on the Panama Canal started. The Russo-Japanese War. The Dreyfus Affair. Indiana became the first place in the world to mandate sterilization for eugenics purposes. The Ford Model T entered production. The first military aircraft was constructed and purchased. Halley's Comet came back. Superconductivity was discovered. And the first parachute jump from an airplane was made, among many, many, many other things.
Well, there was a significant publication.
Oh yeah, I forgot. The famous epistolary novel Dracula by Bram Stoker was published in 1897. It's excellent. Please go read it.
Called The Origin of Species in 1859.
Yeah, that happened too.
Where Charles Darwin is proposing that we can see that life is just a result of random chance processes and evolutionary ideas, and we no longer need God.
Yeah, nowhere in The Origin of Species does it say anything about God except to credit him with the creation of the first one or few life forms from which the rest evolved. Further, Darwin didn't know about mutation and had no explanation for the origin of new diversity in organisms, so he didn't promote anything that was particularly random. It's almost like Jen has never read The Origin of Species.
Right, in science. And we can see how the scientific community kind of embraced this and moved forward with it down to the very definitions in the dictionary.
Yeah, that definition that never included God in the first place. So right now our evidence for God being ousted is 1, a dictionary definition that doesn't include God, 2, a book that does include God, and 3, another dictionary definition that doesn't include God. This seems like what some people have called a nothing burger.
If we move forward to 2023...
110 years, eh? Don't worry, I won't list a bunch of stuff that happened in that time.
We can say that science is knowledge covering general truths, they've added that to the definition, tested through the scientific method.
Seems like a good definition that closely aligns to how English speakers in 2023 tend to use the word.
This is significant because a secular scientist would disagree with me. They would say there are not two types of science. There's just one type of science. We use a scientific method, and processes have always been the same.
Remember, anytime the word secular is used before scientist by a creationist, it can just be ignored, because they just mean scientist. So a scientist would tell her that there are not two types of science, which should, to her, be an indication that she's full of more than normally can fit in a human colon. Which, she is. If all the members of a certain profession tell you what their profession is about, maybe rather than arguing with them, you should just accept that that's what their profession is about. And if you thought you were part of their profession, but they disagree with you, just get a new name for whatever it is you do. So Jen here isn't a scientist, but she can call herself a professional bullshit slinger. See how easy that is?
But we can clearly see events of the Bible, like a catastrophic global flood, where events in the past are distinctly different from what we observe today, events that we're never going to see again.
First, we can't see a single bit of evidence indicative of a global flood, and second, science does not preclude one-off events. In some ways, all events are unique events, because that exact event will not happen again. What is held to be constant in science are not the exact events and processes of the present, but the laws that govern the universe from a physical standpoint. And this is the thing that allows empiricism in the first place. If you can't assume that the universe operates the same way yesterday, today, and tomorrow, then there's no reason to think that past data can be used to predict future data. But that's what science is all about. Science doesn't reject a worldwide flood because there's no flood like that right now, but because based on just plain physics, we know what such a flood would leave behind, namely a single globally correlated turbidite deposit. There is no such deposit, ergo there was no such flood. Further, we know what kinds of things a flood absolutely cannot produce, such as hundreds of feet of non-flocculated biogenic limestone, Aeolian sandstone, non-flocculated shale, etc. And that's exactly what we do find, so again, there was no global flood.
So we know there is a distinct difference between historical and observational science.
For the Bible tells me so isn't going to cut it in science. Science depends on empirical data, and the Bible isn't empirical data. If the AIG interpretation of the Bible were true, then the data would support it. They do not. Therefore, the problem is not with the data, but with either the Bible or AIG's interpretation of it, or both.
So here's the problem, is we see these articles out there, right? Lots of articles. And as a Christian, how do we answer these through a biblical lens? Because we're constantly confronted with this, and you may even be challenged with these questions by your family members and loved ones.
As a Christian, you should treat these articles the same way anyone else does. If it's important to you, examine the evidence while ignoring any preconceived notions you may have to the maximum extent possible. In cases where you can't do that, then you should just take the word of the experts. If that leads you as a Christian to be at odds with the theology of Ken Ham, then tough for him. Ken Ham isn't the king of Christianity.
And what we find is as we look at these questions, is there truth? Is there alien life? And all these questions.
Is there truth and is there alien life seem like very different questions. One is a question about metaphysics, and the other one about an empirical possibility.
We see this growing belief in science, as I like to say, to the point that
people abandon verifiably untrue ideas like a literal Adam and Eve in a literal garden, or a literal global flood, or just the existence of basically everyone from Noah to Moses who's mentioned in the Bible. Yeah, that does happen as a belief in science increases. It's almost like science, archaeology, and history are rigorous fields that have debunked naive Christian theology, just like they already debunked the flat earth and heliocentrism. Although I'll say that the flat earth was debunked long before Christianity came about, and I don't have any evidence of any influential Christian writers arguing in favor of a flat earth.
They're looking at science as their basis for truth, as their foundation or their lens upon which they're viewing the world, and they're trusting science as a religion.
No, we're trusting science as the most reliable way to gain information about the natural world. Science isn't something with a distinct community, a sacred profane distinction, ritual practice, or any ideas about the supernatural. It has no moral code, no set of taboos, nothing that would make it a religion under any definition.
And we can actually see this when we see articles and publications out there. So here's an example. I actually saw this. I was driving one day and I saw this ad and I was like, wow, that's really profound, and I can't believe I'm seeing that.
No one cares about your anecdote, Paul Rivera. Just get to the point.
And they actually said in real big letters, "In science lives hope." And on the bottom it says, "The authors of breakthroughs, the ambassadors of hope, with you we embrace a spirit of purpose. We offer hope. In science lies hope."
Well, since we're picturing a person in the hospital, this is clearly contextualized as hope for things like health and longer life, which science has been doing a pretty outstanding job of delivering. On the other hand, various non-scientific methods like chiropractic, acupuncture, crystals, homeopathy, and faith healing have been providing nothing past placebo, and in some cases have been actively harmful.
So society wants you to believe that science is your pathway to hope.
I don't know about society, but at least the University of California's health department seems to want you to take hope in the advancement of medical science, which seems helpful, and nothing about this indicates that it should be the only source of hope for you, just that it should be a source of hope. And I have trouble seeing an argument against that, given that most of my audience probably would be dead by now if not for medical science. Yeah, you, listening, you'd probably have died by now without medical treatments such as antibiotics, vaccines, or even something as simple as a root canal.
Well, science can provide treatments, can it?
Yes, it can. That's rather the point.
Absolutely. Can it provide cures? Sure it can, right? God allowed those processes in nature to do that.
Well then, it sounds like it's a great place to put one's hope in for better medical outcomes.
It can create innovative technology. Science can do that. It can send a man to the moon, but can science provide hope?
Yes, if what you want is to not die of, say, that pancreatic cancer you just found out you have, then it absolutely can provide hope. If you want to hope that your consciousness will survive the death of your body, then no, it cannot. It's almost like there's more than one kind of hope that's possible, and that hope in general can come from many places. I once hoped that Disney would do a good job making a coherent Star Wars sequel trilogy, since they'd done such a good job keeping the MCU internally consistent and building stories across multiple movies up until that point. Turns out that hope was dashed. I once hoped that an ongoing coup attempt in Washington, D.C. wouldn't replace the already deplorable United States government with a new one that was fascist in all but name. Turns out that hope was fulfilled. Neither of those was really much about God or science.
No.
Oh well, when you put it that way, never mind, I guess. I hadn't considered the amazing response of no. I guess I'll become a young Earth creationist again, since apparently I can't have hope that a doctor can cure me with medical science.
Well, when we start to believe that science can provide hope, though, we start to believe that
vaccines work? I know AIG has been pretty iffy on that, and trust in vaccines does correlate with education and trust in science broadly. So I can see why they'd want to undermine the same.
Well, maybe science can save your soul.
Science has yet to find any indication of such a thing in the natural world, and so this has absolutely nothing to say about whether such a thing even exists. Never mind if it needs to be saved or how it could be saved. I have trouble believing that Jen doesn't know that.
And there's actually publications to this.
This ought to be good.
I came across this article that said, "The Miracle of Science with Soul." And here's what they say. It's not enough just to heal the body. We combine science with soul to create medical miracles.
City of Hope is just a holistic cancer treatment organization that attempts to make sure that the patient is treated for emotional well-being while not neglecting the basic health routines that should be followed regardless of whether one has cancer or not. If you look at their website, they include things like taking time to relax, eating healthy, etc. Nothing in there is actually about a supernatural essence of self that may survive death or anything that a Christian would actually recognize as a soul. Basically, their whole deal is that you're more likely to fight off and recover from cancer if your mental and physical well-being is maintained to the maximum extent possible while you're undergoing treatment. I'm not sure that's exactly a replacement for religion. Also note that when someone is talking about science and publication, that word means in that context peer-reviewed papers, not just some website advertising a cancer clinic.
All right, so we following this? We now have this belief and trust in science. We believe that is our only source of hope.
No, Jen is the one who introduced the word only in the mix. Nothing that we were actually shown said or implied that in the least. This is just a straw man version of ads for a cancer treatment and a university health department being dressed up as a boogeyman to scare Christians away from science. It's frankly disgusting.
And now we actually believe that it can create miracles.
Miracles are definitionally not part of the natural world, and therefore they are neither allowed as explanatory mechanisms in science, nor, if they exist, are they able to be studied by science.
It's starting to sound a lot like a religion, isn't it?
Yes, Karen. Jennifer. This straw man is sounding like a religion, which I suspect is rather the point of making the straw man in the first place. Also, don't think I've overlooked the fact that the best evidence that she could come up with for her straw man was advertising material for a college health department and a cancer treatment center.
Well, what is this missing?
Ritual practices, taboos, a definable community, a distinction between sacred and profane, some supernatural beliefs. Now granted, you don't have to have all of these to be a religion, but you generally have to have some. For example, ethno-religions like Judaism don't always require supernatural beliefs, but generally you need most of these to be treated as a religion. Science has none except maybe a definable community if you count scientists, but then since most people accept science without being scientists, that would mean that this science religion doesn't extend to them, which seems odd since what Jen is whining about is mostly the beliefs derived from science that are at odds with her religious beliefs.
Well, it's kind of missing an evangelist. Well, guess what? They have one. Science has one, and he has actually admitted to it.
Fun fact, you don't need evangelizers to be a religion. Christianity and Islam, and to an extent Buddhism, may have a long history of evangelism, but many other religions do not. Examples include Hinduism, Mandaism, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism. In fact, some religions, like the Druze religion, Mandaism, and Zoroastrianism, don't even accept converts. You're either born into the religion, or you're at best a welcome guest and observer. That being said, things that aren't strictly religions still have people trying to spread them. Most political movements that are not explicitly religious, or that are even anti-religious, have evangelists. Other things like Scientology, which even most adherents don't think of as a religion, have active recruitment wings. Heck, I evangelize for my Patreon, and you can get a 15% discount if you go to my Patreon linked in the description and choose to pay annually. It'll give you access to over 5 months of content, a special supporter-only Discord server, and at the $5 or above level, your name in the credits. Join now, or your soul will forever be forced to watch really, really bad movies while someone explains cinematography to you.
So let's listen to this short clip by Richard Dawkins. He's one of the leading atheists and evolutionists.
Let's just not. Richard Dawkins is not the patriarch of evolution, he's not the high priest of atheism, and he's not the Khalifa of skepticism. He's an asshole who was pretty good at biology back when he was still doing it. That's it. I'm not interested in defending him or anything anyone has to say about him. After we cut back, you'll hear Jen use the third-person masculine singular pronoun in the nominative. The antecedent to this is Richard Dawkins.
But, he believes in evolutionary ideas. Is there any evidence for that?
Is there any evidence that Richard Dawkins believes evolutionary ideas? Hell yes. Like, his entire publication record should suffice. But of course, despite that being what Jen asked, she is apparently as competent at speaking English as she is at the philosophy of science. But I happen to know she is actually asking if there is any evidence of evolution. So let's see, here's some of it. There are also things like the twin-nested hierarchy of morphology and genetics, observed evolution both in the lab and in the wild, chromosome fusion not just in humans but in cervids, arctoideans, and suids, and the whole of the fossil record, etc. There are at minimum hundreds of millions of peer-reviewed publications providing support for the theory of evolution. Never mind all the other stuff which is similarly well supported that creationists like to ignore. Like basic chemistry, thermodynamics, relativity, quantum physics, etc. In the evidentiary department, creationism stands proudly alongside flat earth, homeopathy, and the electric universe, all tied for zero evidence.
No. Is there any observational process for that we can observe and record and repeat?
Gene sequencing, fossil analysis, morphological analysis, and laboratory experiments in evolution are all observable and repeatable, so yes. If she instead means that the exact sequence of individuals and their genomes that have ever existed, well, no, but that's also true for all kinds of science. You can test the compressive strength of steel over and over, but you can't test the same exactly reproduced piece of steel down to the atomic level. Does that make material science just a bad faith religion? I somehow doubt it, especially since Answers in Genesis had to rely on it to make their Ark Encounter and Creation Museum, since without it, the buildings wouldn't even stand up.
No. Is he relying on something he has to take by faith? Yes.
Oh, I forgot that in Creationistese, the words evidence and faith are basically antonyms of what they are in standard English.
Right? Evolution is very much a religion as well, and sadly, he is a victim of his own religion.
Imagine being that smug after saying so little of substance.
So, what a lot of people don't realize is if we take a look at science and look at it through history, and some of the most influential scientists that we can see actually studied science for the sole purpose of giving honor and glory to the Creator God.
Yeah, and plenty still do. You're allowed to be a theist and a scientist. What you're not allowed to be is a theist, agnostic, or atheist who engages in pseudoscientific conspiracy theories like young Earth creationism rather than doing science. I feel like Christian scientists like Francis Collins or Bob Barker probably would say that their definitively pro-evolution science work glorifies God, and you know what? I'm not even here to argue with them. I don't think that science necessarily leads to disbelief in God, even the Christian God. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but there are a bunch of scientists who seem to agree with me on that.
And if we look at Sir Francis Bacon, who is the very scientist who developed the scientific method, he testified too that he believed in the biblical Creator God.
We also have Werner Arber, a famous geneticist, Catholic, and theistic evolutionist.
We also have Galileo.
He was actually kind of a bad scientist, but oh well. We also have Peter Dodson, another Catholic and expert on ceratopsians.
Sir Isaac Newton, which is considered to be the most important and influential scientist in history, also studied and developed his scientific ideas because he wanted to give glory to the Creator of the universe.
We also have Darrell R. Falk, geneticist, Protestant, and advisor for Biologos, a Christian ministry with a theistic evolution standpoint.
We also have William Durham.
And we have Charles A. Foster, who is an evolutionary biologist and wrote a book series in defense of theistic evolution called The Selfless Gene.
And then we have John Hutchinson.
Then we have John Gruden, a developmental biologist who is also a member of the Church of England.
Carl Linnaeus, the father of our biological classification.
And we have Brian Heap, a biologist and founding member of the International Society for Science and Religion.
John Dulick.
It's DeLuke, not Dulick, but okay. There's also Malcolm Jeeves, a psychologist and author of numerous books about faith and Christianity.
Michael Faraday.
John Roughgarden, an evolutionary biologist and outspoken theist.
And Louis Pasteur.
And Gillian Prance, botanist and former president of Christians in Science.
Every single one of them, what we would say biblical believing, right, scientist.
Yep, both hers and mine.
Who believed in the Creator God of the universe and the creation that God described there.
Which it doesn't, so we already know this argument isn't going to be sound.
So now if that word means, science means knowledge.
Yep, also true of my list. The difference is that my scientist list has more evidence and also, like Newton, are willing to not use the same interpretive framework as Answers in Genesis. Oh, did you think I wasn't going to touch on the fact that Newton rejected the Trinity and the divinity of Christ? Yeah, he did, and according to Answers in Genesis, he wouldn't even count as a Christian.
Well, let's take a look at the knowledge of God.
Nah, I'm not about theology. I'll skip that.
True study of science cannot exist without God.
Sure it can. The only assumption science needs is that single one required for empiricism, that past data can predict future data. And that does not logically depend on the existence of a God.
You know, Proverbs 2:6 tells us, "For the Lord gives wisdom from his mouth, come knowledge and understanding."
Yeah, well, Surah 9:1-2 says, "This is a discharge from all obligations by Allah and his messenger to the polytheists you believers have entered into treaties with. You polytheists may travel freely throughout the land for 4 months, but know that you will have no escape from Allah, and that Allah will disgrace the unbelievers."
And Proverbs 15:14 goes on to say, "The heart of him who has understanding seeks knowledge."
Cool. And Omni 1:2 says, "Wherefore in my days I would that ye should know that I fought much with the sword to preserve my people, the Nephites, from falling into the hands of their enemies, the Lamanites. But behold, I of myself am a wicked man, and I have not kept the statutes and commandments of the Lord as I ought to have done."
And then the Bible promises we will acquire that knowledge in Proverbs 18:15.
The Popol Vuh says, "Then also the face of the earth was dried up by the sun, like a person was the sun when he revealed himself. Hot was his face, and thus he dried the surface of the earth. Before the sun had come forth, the face of the earth was wet. It was soggy prior to the coming forth of the sun. But when the sun ascended upward, he was like a person. His heat could not be endured. This was but his self-revelation when he was born. What is left is but a mirror. What appears now is not the true sun, according to their account." See how none of this matters since science is about empirical evidence, not what's written in the Bible, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, the Ginza Rabbah, the Guru Granth Sahib, or the Popol Vuh?
Well, one way we like to equip our kids here to defend the faith is
blatant lies and misinformation while discouraging basic health care?
like I said, letting them participate in science programs where they can see it directly confirms God's word. And we actually have this brand new event coming up next year. It's going to be a STEM challenge.
Nope, no advertisements for AIG bullshit on my channel, not after the hassle they've given me with false copyright claims.
Now let's take a look at the word knowledge through what we call the 7 C's of creation, which is kind of at the heart of the ministry here, especially at the Creation Museum. You're going to walk through the 7 C's of history while you're here.
Oh good. Bad world building based on cherry-picking which parts of the narrative of Genesis and the Gospels AIG chooses to take literally versus not, regardless of whether they have a consistent set of criteria for it beyond, if we take this bit literally, even our gormless marks won't buy into it.
So if we go to Genesis 1:1, the Bible tells us in the beginning God created.
That's true.
And when God created, he created man with knowledge of him, right? The Bible tells us in Genesis 1:26-27.
I feel like I vetted this video, but I did not remember how much "the Bible tells me so" there is compared to claims about science. Oh well, I guess it's time for another skip. All it is just her saying how you know God is real, but you lie to yourself. That's insultingly dumb.
So what happened is humans chose to corrupt God's perfect knowledge.
Not according to Genesis. In Genesis 2:15-17 we read, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and care for it. And the Lord God commanded the man, 'You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die.'" Then it's the story of Eve being created from the side of Adam. Then we get Genesis 3:1-7. "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden. But God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.' 'You will not certainly die,' the serpent said to the woman. 'For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." See how in the actual text of Genesis, the tree simply opens their eyes and there's nothing implying that the knowledge is corrupted? In fact, when God kicks them out after apparently not knowing what happened, at least according to AIG, if we take the story literally like they want us to, the reason they're kicked out isn't because of corrupted knowledge, but because if they eat from the tree of life, they will then both be immortal and have the knowledge of God, something God finds unacceptable. If anything, the knowledge gained is in fact true, and that seems to be something God finds threatening. It's basically just another version of the story of Prometheus bringing fire to mankind. Now, I don't mean that the two stories are directly related, just that both are ideologies for the existence of the knowledge humans have that allow them to live in societies more complex and hopefully more moral than those of the beasts. And this knowledge being something God or the gods doesn't want them to have. See, the thing is, if you take the story literally as a historical narrative, which is what Answers in Genesis says they do, you have an ignorant God who has a physical body and who is scared of immortal and knowledgeable humans. By the way, the translation I use here is the New International Version, just because it was what was first at hand.
Right? We chose to disobey the creator of the universe.
I mean, no one alive right now did, but hey, good news, Christians. You don't have to believe in original sin in the sense that you're held morally culpable for something you didn't do. But this isn't Dapper tells Christians how to have a more sophisticated and less horribly fundamentalist theology hour.
In fact, if we go to Genesis 3:1, we can see where the serpent said to the woman, did God actually say, right? The first attack on the authority of God's word. The serpent went on in verse 4 to say, you're not going to die if you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, even though God specifically told them not to.
And if we're taking the text as literal historical narrative, the snake was correct. God said that Adam would die on the day he ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He did not. That was God who lied, if we're to take Answers in Genesis hermeneutics seriously and consistently.
And in Genesis 3:6, we see the woman saw the tree was good for food and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, right? And that's what's so important there. So humans corrupted God's perfect knowledge, bringing sin, death, disease, and suffering into his perfect creation.
Only if you import a bunch of traditional Christian interpretation, that is certainly not letting the text speak for itself on its own terms. When you do that, you get a very different story.
Now that takes us to the third C of history, which is catastrophe. So after Adam and Eve are then cast out of the Garden of Eden, they did populate the earth. And in about 1,500 years, the Bible tells us that mankind was so exceedingly wicked. Genesis 6:5 actually says their thoughts were wicked all the time.
They were taking wicked poops. They were picking out wicked curtain colors. They were nursing babies with malice. When they were snoring in bed, they had wicked dreams. Or maybe we could take this story as a morality tale about how serious evil is. But hey, if creationists want to believe it, I can't really stop them, except to point out that we know for certain that it didn't happen in the same way that we know that there's no dome over the earth with windows in it to let in the rain and snow.
That a righteous God had to come down and pass judgment.
Yes, it was very important that God kill all those wicked babies who were doing things like reaching for shiny objects with ill intent, and nursing from their mother's breasts with hatred in their hearts. Yep, this checks out. And of course, that's not to mention all the animals that were, also evil?
And that we know is the biblical account of the global flood, leading to this catastrophe that we saw in the earth in the Bible.
I'm going to need a reminder on where in the earth we saw a global flood. Was it in the sediments that can't have been laid down by a flood? Was it in the lack of an actual global flood deposit? Was it in the complete lack of evidence for worldwide catastrophic hydrological erosion?
Now, there was one righteous man, though, during this time. The Bible tells us that. Genesis 6:9 said, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation.
So were his sons and daughters-in-law and wife also continuously evil? See, I wouldn't do this if Answers in Genesis had a consistent and non-science denying hermeneutic. Instead, they do, and they encourage conspiracy theories, transphobia, homophobia, and the rejection of life-saving medical interventions. That makes them continuously evil.
But the Bible is clear that only Noah and his immediate family survived the global flood.
If only humans had low enough genetic diversity to explain descent from an effective population size of less than 5, 4,400 years ago. Oh well, they don't. That's another one blown out of the water by observable, testable, repeatable science. Oh, and in case you're wondering, we calculate this using the long-term substitution rate, and the fact that on the ark, each gene in the genome could have at most 10 alleles present between the 8 people on board, 6 to account for the wives, and 2 each for Noah and his wife. That's ignoring non-recombining DNA such as the Y chromosome and mitochondria. The substitution rate is measured by looking at the amount of mutations that accumulate in a lineage with a known divergence time from another population. You then check the maximum divergence in the part of the genome in question, and then, looking at divergence time, do a bit of high school algebra, and quick as you like, there's a substitution rate. It has been done with a few populations here in the real world, like the inhabitants of Tristan da Cunha and the natives of the Canary Islands, both of which have known historical divergence time and known parent populations.
Now, after the global flood, God gave them some instructions. They were on the ark about a year, and God said, well, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And of course, at this time, we had a catastrophe. So we literally have the crust of the earth breaking open, and we have
enough heat to boil the oceans a dozen times over and melt the granite crust of the earth. And that's not me saying that. That's the RATE team saying that. The Young Earth Creationist research team that utterly failed to find a way to overcome the great age of the Earth without invoking miracles, and who admitted that their flood models resulted in orders of magnitude too much heat for the Ark to survive. And who admitted that the evident age of the rocks from radioactive decay was accurate, and that only changing the laws of physics could solve either problem.
The land masses beginning to move into the places that we see them today.
A process which on its own would melt them from just the friction if compressed to just over a year, which is the time frame we're talking about here.
And in Genesis 9:1, in these 2 commands, we can see that Noah and his descendants fulfilled 50% of this. All right, so they did multiply, but they did not fill the earth. And that takes us to our 4th C of history, which is confusion.
Confusion, confusion, confusion.
And in confusion, what we can clearly see in the Bible is once again that human desire for knowledge.
No, again, this is another story about God being scared of humans. Here's Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. This is not a story of an omnipotent God if taken seriously. Why should God be worried about a tall tower? I mean, humans have made ridiculously tall towers, and they suffered no language confusion. Is a Bronze Age tower really a problem for a god in a way that matters? I mean, this really feels like a what does God need with a starship moment.
And so what those humans did is they stayed together in the plains of Shinar, and they decided they're going to build a tower to heaven to self-glorify themselves, not glorify the creator of the universe.
At which point, God apparently got scared and confused their languages. Apparently, God had never heard of the phenomenon of pidgin languages. That is, languages that result when populations who do not share a language come in frequent and sustained contact. They form a hybrid language that tends to take the simplest grammar from either language for a particular thing, and tend to borrow vocabulary from both. Confusing languages would halt a building project for maybe a year tops in real life. Much past that, and we might even get people learning the new languages, which is a thing humans are known to be able to do, although it's less common among Americans.
In fact, the Bible tells us in Genesis 11:4, they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." Right? That was their intent in building the Tower of Babel.
Oh, so it wasn't to gain knowledge, which makes sense, since it's hard to see how building a tower would do that on its own. But also odd then that Jen said it would be about gaining knowledge. It's like she's actually not concerned at all about the Bible, and instead is just concerned with her co-religionists being as ignorant and anti-intellectual as possible. Now, why would that be? Could it be because that's the only way to keep the money flowing into the Answers in Genesis coffers? It certainly is a lot of money, and now with a new boss, that's probably more important than ever. Although, to be fair, this was recorded before that happened.
Well, righteous God had to come down and pass judgment.
Yeah, otherwise they'd finish that tower, and the omnipotent God wouldn't be able to stop them. Or maybe this is a non-historical etiology for the fact that more than one language exists, even though clearly it would be more convenient if only one did.
And he confused and changed the languages. And this is where we see the human population then dispersing across the face of the earth, which is what he had asked them to do originally.
And that's why the highest genetic diversity and lowest linkage disequilibrium in the world is found in Iraq. Wait, I'm getting something from my producer? It seems that, in fact, it's Eastern Africa, specifically Ethiopia. Well, that's odd. Oh, and apparently all non-African human lineages are in fact a subset of African genetic diversity? Well, that rather eliminates the possibility that all humans descended from a group in modern Iraq.
Now that leads us to our fifth C of history, which is Christ.
That's right, all that stuff between Genesis and Matthew? Get rid of it. Who cares? 10 Commandments? More like boring commandments. Hezekiah? Never heard of him. Solomon? Sounds like some kind of furniture I'll never own. What's a Hasmonean? Is that like some kind of food made of fish and breadcrumbs? I don't know. It's time for Pontius Pilate and the innocents that he didn't kill while not trying to get to Jesus.
And the Old Testament prophesied multiple times about the coming of the Savior.
Nope, that's not a C. Let's get on with it. After this, oddly enough, the last C is the Parousia, but whatever, we're skipping that because that's theology and not science.
So we have taken a look at knowledge through the lens of those 7 C's of history, where God created us with the inborn knowledge of God, but man corrupted that knowledge.
Not according to Genesis, which is odd since you'd think that an organization called Answers in Genesis might be able to get what's in there right. According to Genesis, humans were created in ignorance of morality, and God wanted to keep it that way. They decided to gain that knowledge, at which point it turns out that when God threatened them with death, that was just a fun little goof. But he did kick them out of his garden and deny them immortality, because then they would be equal to his divine council, that is, the gods. Because the story comes from a time when the Hebrews weren't actually monotheists. The only one who can be reasonably said to have corrupted the knowledge of humans in the first few chapters of Genesis is God.
And because of man's desire for knowledge, right, we see the confusion that occurred. But Christ is knowledge, and he promises one to restore that knowledge.
Hard to restore the thing that you didn't have in the first place because God kept it from you, but sure, whatever. The funny thing is that humans have been gaining knowledge this whole time. That's why it is that Hall can appear here on a flat sheet of what was once mostly sand, and how you can hear her despite her not being anywhere within earshot of you. At least I assume she's not in your bedroom or bathroom or wherever you're watching this from. If humans weren't gaining knowledge from science, none of this technology would work, and this science was not done by checking what the Bible said, but by gathering and analyzing empirical data.
So now let's take a look at what science, which means knowledge, can and cannot do.
Oh good, we're like 20 minutes into this talk and we finally get to the thing the title implies the whole talk is about. Also, it still doesn't just mean knowledge.
So can science truly answer why we sleep?
Currently, no, it can't. But can it in principle? I don't see why not. It's a natural phenomenon near as anyone can tell, and it seems almost universal to animal life. Even animals with the most rudimentary nervous systems have what seems like rest stages. I doubt that the solution is going to be ghosts or goblins or angels or demons. I guess it could be, but the fact that we don't currently have all the answers isn't a good reason to say it's a miracle.
They've studied people sleeping, right?
Yep, there's this whole thing you can do called a sleep study in which they hook up electrodes to your scalp and scan your brainwaves while you sleep to see if they can figure out why you're having bad sleep. I haven't done one, but it sounds unpleasant.
We also can explain why people dream, or what they dream, or why they dream certain things.
Actually, that we have a decent handle on. When you're dreaming, your brain is processing memories from the recent past to form longer-term memories, since your short-term memory is a bit like memory in a computer. It's not going to last long, but it can be written to and read from rapidly. It seems like the actual experience of a dream is pulled from both these memories and long-term memories that you associate with the new ones. For example, if you made a memory about eating a meal similar to one that you shared with a friend, you may dream of that friend. Now, do we have all the answers we could want from science about this topic? No, of course not. We don't have that about any topic. But that doesn't negate what we do know. Generally speaking, this isn't even a gap to shove God into.
We really can't explain why birds migrate. Now, we know it has something to do with the seasons. We've observed that.
We absolutely can explain why birds migrate. They do so because the food they eat isn't available in every place year-round. That's why birds do things like fly south in northern winter and fly north in southern winter. It's to go where there's food. And also, this means that they tend to have breeding grounds that are based on this migration. Food and sex are some of the most important things to any organism, because both directly contribute to the organism's reproductive output, which is really all that evolution cares about, if you'll allow me to anthropomorphize an unconscious process. Birds are also not the only animals to make seasonal migrations to make sure they get food. Many other animals will do so too, especially various ruminants such as wildebeests, and they basically do so for the same reasons. It's just that birds can fly, and so they can make extreme migrations, and also, they're fairly obvious while they do it, since you get an unobstructed view of them in the sky, a lot of the time. Really, the whys of bird migration isn't at all a mystery. Now, just like in all of science, there are details of what's going on that we don't know about. The exact manner all birds migrate isn't known. Exactly what signals they use to determine when to migrate is also not known. Although we do know that the timing of migrations is changing as the climate changes. But hey, AIG are climate change deniers, so they probably say that that is not in fact happening.
But no one's ever sat down with a bird and said, hey, why do you go to this same bird feeder year after year as you travel down the eastern part of the United States to South Florida?
The same reason that every time I drove from Phoenix to Las Cruces, I stopped at the same gas station with a burger joint with the hilarious dinosaurs outside Holbrook. I remember it, and when on my previously frequent migrations from Phoenix to Las Cruces, I tended to be both hungry and in need of gas at around the time I got there. I took a typical route, and there were reliable food spots. One of them happened to come up just as I needed it.
Right, we just can't do that. So we can have theories and ideas based on what we observe, but we can't truly explain it.
What does that even mean? What is a scientific explanation if not the theory that explains the phenomenon in question? If you want me to explain how an internal combustion engine works, I'm going to have to use thermodynamics. If you want me to explain how a rocket ship gets to Jupiter, I'm going to have to use the theory of universal gravitation. This just sounds like word games to preclude science from truly answering questions. Are most of these things science can't explain actually things that are easily explained? I hope not. There are big mysteries in science, like are there actually physical singularities at the end of black holes? Or why are inertial and gravitational mass coupled?
And we definitely can't explain why tomatoes have 30,000 genes while humans have 20,000.
Actually, that's pretty easy to explain. Tomatoes and their relatives, grapes and potatoes, had before their divergence a genome triplication. Whole genome duplication is actually not that unusual. Tetrapods have at least one genome duplication in their history. So while tomatoes have some 35,000 genes today, this is relatively recent in evolutionary timescales, and some 8 million years ago or so, their ancestors had about 12,000 genes. In fact, the tomato genome is divided into 3 subgenomes, which, while not identical, are clearly structurally linked, and in some cases the genes in these are still the same genes making the same product in each of the subgenomes. This also applies to potatoes and grapes. Once again, we get a gap to shove God into that isn't even a gap in the first place. The God of the gaps is never a good idea, but at least shove him into gaps that are real.
Don't know, right?
Nope, we do in fact know. All you have to do is check. I didn't even have to check the Scholar version of Google. A regular search turned up peer-reviewed literature on tomato genetics.
So there's definitely some things I would say science, that we see, whereas humans try to explain this, cannot answer.
There are, but for some reason, Jennifer really sucks at figuring out what those things are. She seems to have just picked things she herself doesn't know, regardless of how much we actually know about these subjects.
And we also, right, science cannot answer moral judgments.
Yeah, that's what moral philosophy is for.
I mean, what was your job?
I was a professor of ethics and moral philosophy.
Motherforker!
Aesthetic interpretations, how to use knowledge once we gather it.
Again, various other parts of philosophy. Is this whole section just science doesn't do things that aren't science? Science is about the operation of the natural world, not what you ought to do with that knowledge. Science isn't concerned with moral or aesthetic questions. Complaining about this is like rejecting Christianity because the Bible is useless for helping you pass your driving test. There's no reason it should help you with that, and the truth of Christian distinctive beliefs doesn't rely on driving tests. Similarly, there's no reason science should be expected to tell you what your preference in decor should be, or whether or not, now that you know how to make white phosphorus, if you should spray it all over a Palestinian population center. Spoiler alert, no you should not. That's what we call a war crime. Looking at you, State of Israel.
And spiritual concepts.
Spiritual concepts are, by definition, outside the scope of science. If there's any such thing as a spiritual realm, then it's not part of the natural world, and science is about the natural world.
So let's take a look at morality.
Let's do it.
Secular scientists actually admit that science does not have this answer.
Auto mechanics actually admit that they don't have answers for how to resolve the crisis in cosmology. Who knew that scientists aren't moral philosophers? It's almost like those are different areas of study. Next thing you know, we'll be informed that the Bible doesn't have the answers of how to fix a computer that hung during a Windows update.
The science helps us describe how the world is, but it cannot make any judgments about whether that state of affairs is right, wrong, good, or bad.
That's true.
So where do we go for that answer? Right? Science can't answer it.
Who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?
Plato.
There's only one place we can go, and that's God's perfect word.
Yes, until the Protestant 66-book canon was established, not even 150 years ago, no one was able to figure out morality. That makes sense. We definitely didn't have people like Aristotle, Plato, Descartes, Kant, Epicurus, Spinoza, Hobbes, Locke, Hume, etc., who had anything useful to say about moral philosophy. Nope, only the Bible, and only the version that AIG likes.
It does give us direction.
Not without interpretations by humans. The Bible says in Deuteronomy that if you have a rebellious, gluttonous son, you should have your neighbors kill him by throwing rocks at him until he's literally broken. Humans came around and said, maybe we'll interpret that in a way that no one ever actually meets the criteria. Then some other humans looked at that and said, nah, we don't have to follow that one. But then for some reason decided that they should be mean to gay people, even though both of those are things that are in the same book. But I guess they decided to cherry pick. Not even Christians simply read the text of the Bible and learn morality. They negotiate with the text to ameliorate what they consider the worst aspects, and they center the parts that they consider the best parts, and do so in a way that helps those, in some degree of authority, maintain the status quo that keeps them in that authority. That's just a fact of life when it comes to texts broadly, especially texts that are foundational to a religion's moral stances. That's why Islamists can look at a text and see warrant to slaughter civilians by the thousands, but Ahmadis can look at the same text and see a requirement to be pacifists.
Psalm 119, 137 through 38 says,
Once again, no, I don't care about AIG's interpretation of biblical morality, given how obviously disgusting they are when it comes to that. Time to skip.
well, what about aesthetic? Can science explain why you might like a certain type of art and I might like a different one? Or a certain type of music?
Fully and in detail, no, but human music tends to have certain harmonies and mathematical relationships, which seem to be hardwired into human instinct to be pleasurable to hear. Similarly, there are certain color harmonies and compositional elements which recur in human art, indicating that again there is probably some instinctive sense of what is aesthetic. Why might this be? Well, probably something to do with human prosociality. Humans who share a sense of aesthetic will do things other humans find beautiful, and that promotes prosociality, which is a big part of the human survival strategy. As for your particular personal preferences, this is probably mostly learned behavior, and while science has yet to really solve the problem of consciousness or how the brain learns and recalls information, that doesn't mean that science never will. I don't know if it will, although I have to point out that even if it can't, that doesn't actually provide evidence of things like the Earth only being 6,000 years old, or special creation, or Noah's flood. Even if aesthetic preferences are actually entirely supernatural, and because of the soul and God, even that wouldn't do a single thing to falsify any part of the science that informs us about the history of the universe and planet we live on.
Right? Why do we have all these different types of music? Science can't explain that. Those are all subject to personal interpretations and likes and dislikes. We call that personal appeal.
Okay.
So where do we go for guidance on this if science can't give us an answer?
Is it the Bible? I bet it's the Bible. Every artist knows that the Bible is full of advice on chord progressions, color palettes, and composition.
Well, once again, God's word does. Philippians 4:8 says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable, excellent, worthy of praise, think about these things.
I want all of you to notice that that isn't the Bible telling you what things are aesthetically pleasing or why people differ on this. So that passage is actually irrelevant to the question of why humans have distinct aesthetic preferences. How is that not obvious and embarrassing even to Jennifer here?
Well, since science is not a living entity, it cannot decide where that knowledge is going to be used.
Amazing information from Answers in Genesis here. Science isn't an actual person who has opinions about things. I feel like no one needed that stated, and that no one is disputing this. I've never heard anyone argue for the personhood of a method of investigation and the knowledge gained thereby.
Right? Science cannot say where additional research will be done, where the money is going to be spent that we gain from scientific research, where it's going to be published. Is there going to be a documentary or a blog about this? Science can't make those determinations. Who does? Humans do, right? Humans' decision making and their preferences decide where things like that are going to be published.
Yes, although it's informed by the science involved. Research is funded in part based on how likely it is to be fruitful, based on previous research and predictions from hypotheses and theories involved in that field of study. For example, in paleontology, most paleontology grants are given to people planning expeditions to particular locations where the paleontologists have predicted that they will find certain fossils, based on things like radiometric dating and the theory of evolution. And it works. They actually can find what they're looking for, whether it be early tetrapodomorphs like Tiktaalik or hominins like Australopithecus.
So where do we go for that answer?
The science will tell us what areas will be likely to be fruitful, and then it's up to the values and preferences of the people who have the money that is being sought in grant proposals. It's not the Bible.
Where can we go for guidance on how to use knowledge? Well, once again, we can go to God's Word.
I like how we just switched from how do we allocate research funding to how do we use the knowledge broadly? Those aren't the same question, and there's no way Jen doesn't know that.
And science certainly cannot answer spiritual concepts, right? Science will never be able to measure and answer, is there one all-powerful God? Why is there so much suffering? Why do people do bad things? Why is there sin? What is my purpose in life?
So let's go through those. Is there one all-powerful God? Science probably can't help much with that. Why is there so much suffering? Well, there are various reasons that science can indeed explain, through things like meteorology, virology, bacteriology, seismology, volcanology, oncology, cardiology, etc. Why do people do bad things? Well, because humans are selfish animals, and this falls under psychology, which actually has real answers to the question of why people do behave as they do. What is sin? Yeah, science probably has nothing to say about this. That's more of a theology or moral philosophy question. What happens after death? While science can certainly describe and explain the process of decay, if there's some kind of afterlife, then science has nothing to say about it. What's my purpose? That's something you're going to have to figure out on your own, even if you do believe in a god.
So where do we go?
Oh, that's right. We got to the AIG cherry-picked version of the Bible. Of course, it's the same boring answer every time. No thought, just blind obedience to the extra-biblical theological tradition to which this particular brand of Protestant extremists belong.
So I think it's clear that science has limitations.
Yep, something no one has ever disputed to my knowledge. I mean, I'm sure that there are in fact dummies out there who think that science can answer all questions, but they're as obviously wrong about that as Hal Rivera is about the age of the Earth.
And scientists admit this. They say you never know when your assumptions are going to suddenly become invalid.
Well, except for that assumption at the base of all science, the validity of empiricism, which itself rests on the temporal and spatial invariance of the principles by which the universe operates. What may be invalidated are those so-called assumptions that are based on previous research, which is assumed in subsequent research. If that research turns out to have been an error, then the research based on it being accurate is also tossed out. And you don't know when that will happen. It might never happen.
It's a leap of faith to assume it will, and while these are often good leaps of faith, you cannot prove that the leaps are always valid.
That's why good scientists are always ready to be shown to be wrong and reassess. Now let's see what Answers in Genesis thinks about being ready to be shown to be wrong, shall we? In a call for papers to be submitted to the LARP journal Answers Research Journal, published by AIG and edited poorly by Andrew Snelling, we read this. Answers Research Journal provides scientists and students the results of cutting-edge research that demonstrates the validity of the young Earth model, the global flood, the non-evolutionary origin of created kinds, and other evidences that are consistent with the biblical account of origins. So if you find out that there is evidence of an ancient Earth or common ancestry, or against the historicity of Noah's flood, the Answers Research Journal isn't open to that. Instead, they'll simply auto-reject your paper, so they're not acting like scientists. They're play-acting. They're scientists in the same way that a kid with a plastic stethoscope and a fake syringe is a doctor.
If the laws of nature change over time or behave differently under different conditions or in different directions or locations or aren't applicable to the system you're dealing with, your predictions will be wrong.
First, I want to point out the statement that comes just a bit before this in that paper. Quote, our best theories, like the aforementioned theory of evolution, the Big Bang theory, and Einstein's general relativity, cover all of these bases. They have an underlying quantitative framework enabling us to predict what will happen under a variety of situations, and then go out and test those predictions empirically. So far, these theories have demonstrated themselves to be eminently valid. Where their predictions can be described by mathematical expressions, we can tell not only what should happen, but by how much. For these theories in particular, among many others, measurements and observation that have been performed to test these theories have been supremely successful. Just thought that was worth quoting. Second, the whole article, which is linked in the description, is in fact about the fact that empiricism is not logically demonstrable, and therefore all scientific knowledge is tentative. Yes, in its conclusion it says, this doesn't mean it's impossible to know anything at all. To the contrary, in many ways, scientific knowledge is the most real knowledge that we can possibly gain about the world. The point of the paper is not that we can't know anything about science. It's that scientific knowledge is only ever held for as long as the data support it, and no matter how much evidence we ever have, we can never reach the level of certainty that we can get in math. We can get more than enough evidence to successfully predict future data and make technology, though.
And that's why everything we do in science, no matter how well it gets tested, is always preliminary.
Yes, but that does not warrant to believe in things that have been disconfirmed by science. Because while science can't really prove things, it can disprove things. And basically all of young Earth creationism is in that category.
So what we see here in our culture is a battle of two worldviews, right? There's only two. There's either God's perfect word.
Let's call that what it is, ancient texts interpreted by people in contradictory ways.
Or there is man's imperfect word. We call that a secular worldview.
And to call that what it really is, it's things for which we have evidence and that correspond as far as we can tell to objective reality.
Now, if God created knowledge, and he is knowledge, and he promises one day to restore that perfect knowledge, and there really is only one worldview on which we should study science.
Is it the worldview that takes observable reality seriously and adapts to correspond with what we can verify about it? What am I thinking about? Of course it's not. It's the young Earth view that pretends to take the Bible as it's written, but doesn't even try to do so.
God's word is the rock upon which to build scientific study.
If that's the case, then why is the Answers Research Journal so well guarded by dogmatic gatekeeping submission criteria that anything submitted must be wrong in order to be published? Why is it that the people who insist the strongest that they're just following the Bible in their research, the same ones I keep finding lying about basic science? Weird, isn't it? It's almost like you should base science on what's physically observable, testable, and repeatable, like we do in evolutionary biology, but the opposite of what's done in creationist journals.
And what we find is that science always confirms the Bible.
Here's something fun. If you start with the premise that your particular interpretation of any book in particular is absolutely true, and you are willing to ignore evidence that doesn't fit with that, and that you can't easily explain away, and you misinterpret other evidence that doesn't support your idea, you can find that science doesn't contradict that book. It'll work with the Quran, the Mahabharata, the Lord of the Rings, or your favorite Star Trek novel, which is, of course, Star Trek: First Frontier, because it's the one with raptors in it.
Right? And that is what's so important to understand today.
Ironically, I agree. It is important to remember that with enough intellectual dishonesty, you can find evidence that a book you decided must be true is true, even that your particular interpretation is true.
You know, Psalms 111:2 says,
It's Psalm 111:2, singular. The book of Psalms is a collection of individual poems, each of which is a psalm. The first psalm isn't the first chapter, it's the first psalm. The 111th psalm is properly cited as Psalm 111. It's always both amusing and annoying when young earth creationists can't even get the basics of the Bible right. I feel like she's one of those types of people who, if you ask them to guess where the New Testament starts in the Bible, would just open it to the middle and be surprised to find herself in like Jeremiah or Ezekiel instead of Matthew. Additionally, we're not listening to her Bible verses. For one thing, it's irrelevant, and for another thing, she's not as good at reading it as I am.
and when we start with God's Word as our starting point, on the lens upon which we study and view science,
You get laughed out of academia, which is largely what has happened, because science starts with data. When those data support something in the Bible, which they sometimes do, such as identifying heretofore unknown characters or places or people groups from the Bible, then okay. But when they don't, you don't get to reject those data and claim that what you're doing is science.
every single scientific discipline is going to directly confirm God's Word.
Yup, because that's how confirmation bias works. That's literally what's happening here. We're being told that if you just stop caring about confirmation bias as a problem, and instead embrace it fully, you'll find that everything is as you thought it would be in the first place. This is neither surprising nor a good thing. It's just a way to be confidently wrong. With this method of thinking, you can convince yourself of anything, like that the Earth is flat, that it's 6,000 years old, that birds aren't real, that 9/11 was an inside job, that the 45th President of the United States won the presidential election in 2020, or that wildfires are started by Jewish space lasers.
Now, we're going to take a look at these 4 areas today, and I'm just going to give you a few examples of where we see direct confirmation of God's Word.
Okay, this is what I've been waiting for. Let's go.
And I want to be very clear, I don't like to use the word evidence.
Yeah, that's not too surprising.
Do we need evidence that God's Word is true?
This crowd obviously doesn't, but if you want to say something is true and not just base it on confirmation bias and the fact that credas consolans, and you want to believe things that are actually true, it behooves you to actually have evidence.
We do not.
Yeah, the Holy Ghost convicted you, showing you the Bible is the Word of God, and that's definitely not just your subconscious wanting it to be true. And don't worry about those people who have the same experience about other religions. They're the ones who are just basing this experience on wish fulfillment. And of course, this is the ultimate admission that she's utterly uninterested in science.
So let's start with biology.
Oh good, we can start with my favorite story about biology in the Bible. This is Genesis 30:25b through 43. Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He added, "Name your wages and I will pay them." Jacob said to him, "You know how I have worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has greatly increased, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied. "But if you do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages, and my honesty will testify for me in the future. Whenever you check on the wages you have paid me, Any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, will be considered stolen." "Agreed," said Laban. "Let it be as you have said." That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs, so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they made it in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself, and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in troughs in front of the animals, so they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there, so the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks, and female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. I'm greatly looking forward to the confirmation that skin pattern works according to the principle of sympathetic magic, rather than genetics controlling reaction-diffusion interactions.
So a secular worldview, they're going to tell you that there is an evolutionary tree of life.
That's true.
There is this little tiny blob that we can't explain.
She's obviously talking about the last universal common ancestor of all life, usually called Luca. I don't even know what she means by "it can't be explained." I'm not sure what needs to be explained. Its existence is just an outcome of universal common ancestry. If there's sufficient evidence of that model to accept it, then Luca simply existed of logical necessity.
Right, this cell just managed to gain new information and all of a sudden just came to life out of nothing.
No, it had ancestors. Luca wasn't the first living thing on Earth, or at least there's no reason to think it was. That's why it's the last, not the first, universal common ancestor. Further, the origin of life was certainly not a cell forming out of nothing. It was the result of a series of chemical processes, which, while not fully understood, certainly aren't the creation of life ex nihilo. That's more the domain of creationists, even though creation ex nihilo isn't in the Bible. And of course, last but not least, we come to the idea that Luca gained information. Creationists have never actually defined information in organisms in a way that would make it possible to tell if an organism had gained or lost information as a result of mutations. Which means that whether Luca gained or lost information isn't actually a thing we can assess. But we do know of organisms that have gained entire new proteins without losing any of the ones they already had. And if that's not a gain of information, I don't know what is. One of my favorite examples is the evolution of antifreeze glycoproteins in notothenioid fish in and around the Antarctic. They had a duplication of a pancreatic trypsinogen gene. Trypsinogen is a protein that is the precursor to trypsin, which is an enzyme that breaks down proteins in the pancreas for digestion. It's stored as trypsinogen because trypsin isn't very picky, and if it were always around, it would digest the pancreas itself. Anyway, after this duplication, subsequent mutations turn the trypsinogen gene into a gene that makes an entirely new protein that prevents the formation of ice crystals, allowing the fish in question to inhabit colder waters than their cousins who lacked this new protein could, which opened up a whole new habitat to them.
And then over millions of years of death and suffering became the complexity of the tree of life that we see today.
More or less, yes.
But God's word gives us a very different view, doesn't it?
If by that we mean the Bible, then yes, it's almost like it was written by people who didn't have access to all the observations of nature and the hundreds of years of science that modern people have. And so they wrote ideologies about the origins of animals that, while they told people how they should relate to the natural world, didn't really have much to do with the actual literal origin of life forms.
God says he didn't create a tree of life. God says he created an orchard of life.
That's what Ken Ham says. Or said, now that he's stepping down as the real CEO in favor of his role as founding CEO. I don't remember the word orchard showing up anywhere in Genesis 1 or 2. In fact, there's no indication in the Bible that the kind is much different to the modern concept of species. Indeed, when St. Jerome translated the Hebrew word mean, he often used the Latin word specius, or species. Indeed, creationists stuck to species fixity until it was basically pointed out to them that there were far too many species that would have to be on the ark. At that point, they just decided that they'd accept the evolution they'd been railing against for decades, but only a bit, but also really fast during that bit. That allowed them to pretend that they could just take several thousand animals on the ark. Of course, the problem with this is it means that the creationist model is just transparently the same as evolution, but with the tree of life just randomly cut off at places that are convenient for creationists. but which are nakedly arbitrary otherwise.
In fact, Genesis chapter 1 says 10 times that God created everything to reproduce according to its kind.
And then it gives no definition for a kind, meaning that it's impossible to actually figure out what it means that things can't evolve outside their kind or go from one kind to another.
And we can directly observe this in nature.
Creationists can't even describe it in a meaningful way. It's fundamentally impossible to observe a thing in nature if that thing doesn't even have a coherent way to recognize it. Ah, welcome. Please come in. No, Dapper Dinosaur will be back. He came through my world stone a few days ago, cleared out some pesky neighbors, and asked if I could make a video for him. I agreed, so here I am. We're back taking a look at Jennifer Hall Rivera's talk about things science just can't explain, given to an audience at what I believe is the Creation Museum Auditorium. We just got done being told that we can see that organisms only reproduce after their kind, without, of course, being told what a kind is, or what it would look like if it didn't. Now, we're going to be given examples of monophyly in evolution. Then Hall Rivera is going to pretend that that means that evolution is false, even though everything she's talking about is completely in line with how evolution works.
We can see dogs only having more dogs, can't we?
Yes, we can. And, as Dapper said, that's just monophyly in action. So, what is monophyly? It is the idea that the descendants of a common ancestor can't ever be not descendants of that ancestor, and that if we are to base taxa on common ancestry, each taxon should include all and only the descendants of a common ancestor. So, on screen is what I call a monophyly simulation. One main trunk splits 4 times, resulting in 16 tips, representing species in this model emerging from the trunk. Now, here's what the first creationists thought, where each species is a separate creation. Now, creationists recognize that some species do actually share common ancestry, and they base this on things like genetic similarity and differences in the morphological similarities and differences. The problem is that the same techniques can get you back to here, where even more species are shown to share common ancestry. And unless you halt at an arbitrary number, you end up back where we started with universal common ancestry. And that's fundamentally the problem with rejecting species fixity in favor of created kinds. All you can do is accept evolution, but then pretend that it does not work before some arbitrary stopping point.
We can see elephants only having more elephants.
Do I have to break out the tree again? I'll do it if I have to.
Right? We see this all throughout the plant kingdom and animal kingdoms, is that we can predict what these animals are going to have within this orchard of life that God created.
When you accept evolution, you can use it to make predictions about future data. That's true. Here's something else that's cool. If you don't just pretend that evolution has some arbitrary stopping point past which common ancestry stops, then you can predict even more, such as when Tiktaalik was discovered by that Neil Shubin, after predicting that he'd find a transitional form between fully aquatic stenopterygian fish and tetrapods in the frozen hellscape of Arctic Canada. Or as I call it, Canada! Turns out he did it.
Now, interestingly enough, the Human Genome Project was a 15-year study where some of our top geneticists in the world were attempting to map out the human genome.
Yup, and the results were then used along with the results of the Chimpanzee Genome Project to show that humans' closest genetic relatives are the members of genus Pan. Like me. No, it's chimpanzees. Different Pan. That is the common chimpanzee and the bonobo. And they're closer to each other than lions and tigers are genetically. So, bit of a problem if you want common ancestry for all felids, which AIG does. But you also want separate ancestry for humans versus other apes, which AIG also does.
They had a quote on their website that is no longer there. And the first time I saw it, I was just like, wow, that's so simple, but yet it's so profound and directly confirms God's word. And here's what it said.
Who wants to bet that it's not actually actually going to be evidence that humans are a separate creation from all the other life that is on the Earth, and that the Earth is only 6,000 years old.
And so we all know that elephants only give birth to elephants, giraffes to giraffes, dogs to dogs, and so on for every type of living creature. That was one of the conclusions of the 15-year study of the DNA code of life. What did they see?
They saw monophyly, just like they were supposed to, just like evolution logically requires.
Well, dogs are only going to have dogs, aren't they? Cats are only going to have cats. How does that confirm God's word? Genesis chapter 1, right? Tells us 10 times in the very first book of the Bible, God clearly tells us exactly how he created living things, and that is exactly what we observe today in nature.
Hey, it's true. In a case where the predictions of answers in Genesis and science aren't at odds, we see the predictions fulfilled. How shocking, but also very uninformative.
Now, we're going to go back to Richard Dawkins here.
No, we're not. I, like Dapper, don't care about Richard Dawkins. He's still not the king of evolution, or the pope of atheism, or whatever. If anything, he's done more to make atheists sound like idiots than anyone I can think of with his agnostic atheism scale nonsense that has done nothing but make communication between atheists and others confused, tricked numerous non-atheists into thinking that they are atheists, and made it so that online atheist communities don't even know what words like belief, knowledge, and confidence mean. Oh, on top of that, he's a transphobe, so he can go sit on the corner in Turf Island.
Profound, isn't it?
No, it's not. It's just some old man whose competence in philosophy rivals Roger from Mud Fossil U's competence in, well, everything. Saying that he thinks evolution means there's no creator. I don't care.
So let's break this down a little bit and talk about, well, what is natural selection?
Now that's a good question. So the first thing to know is that organisms don't all reproduce with the same success as their conspecifics. This is easy to demonstrate. Just think about your friends and family. You almost certainly know people who've had 0 children, a single child, or multiple children. Next is the fairly obvious fact that some organisms reproduce less or fail to reproduce because of something external to them or internal to them. For example, perhaps they are eaten, or they simply don't reproduce as many gametes as another member of their species. This means that the traits of those organisms that reproduce more will be more common in the next generation, assuming those traits are governed by that organism's genetics. That's it. That's natural selection. Those organisms which reproduce more than average are said to be selected for, and those that reproduce less than average are said to be selected against. There is no entity making choices here. That's important. There is in fact nothing actively making selections. This is an anthropomorphism, which makes it easy to talk about this phenomenon, but it's not literal. And yes, I'm talking to you, Randy Galuza.
Because you're going to find this often with Richard Dawkins and many evolutionists, is they equate natural selection and evolution as the same thing, and they almost use them interchangeably.
That is like saying that someone is conflating touchdowns and American football. If you're talking about touchdowns, you're talking about American football. But you can talk about other aspects of football too. Natural selection is a very important aspect of evolution. It's not the only aspect, and other aspects are vital to the theory. But if you're talking about natural selection, you're talking about evolution.
Natural selection is a loss of information.
First, yes, I recognize how stupid the graphic on screen is, but I will talk about it more and when and if she actually talks about it. Second, once again, we have no way to measure information as creationists mean it, so that's meaningless. Now, natural selection does serve to reduce genetic diversity. There is no evolutionary biologist that doesn't know that. That's like high school level biology information. Mutation adds to genetic diversity. Pretty much all the other mechanisms of evolution, apart from epigenetics, reduce genetic diversity, including sexual selection and genetic drift.
So we can see in the original dog kind, now of course we don't know what the original dog kind looked like,
Well then, we can't see anything in the original dog kind, can we? But also, what do we do with the animals that are almost canines but aren't? Like the Borophagian or bone-crushing dogs, or the Hesperocyanins that were in many ways weasel-like, or so primitive it could almost be the common ancestor of all carnivorans, Miosis. See, once again, we are just arbitrarily cutting off the common ancestry. Also, what is it with young Earth creationists and canines? I mean, I like doggos too, but they seem to only talk about two groups of animals, apes and canines. They do know that bears, flatworms, and amphipods, among so many other groups, exist, right?
We've done a lot of research into that, but let's just imagine we have a wolf like you see here.
So now we're talking about this inane diagram with a wolf Canis lupus at the top, presumably with the most information, followed by a coyote, Canis latrans, then an African painted dog, Lacayon pictus, then a golden jackal, Canis aureus, and finally a dingo, Canis lupus familiaris dingo, which apparently has the least information. I have no idea what gave them the idea that those animals have different amounts of information in the first place. Never mind how they decided that they were in that order. Is it just genetic diversity? Do dingoes have more pseudogenes than coyotes? Is it the genome size of the African painted dog is bigger than that of the jackal? I have no idea, and the thing is that neither do they, because any actual definition they gave of information would immediately show that, in fact, mutation can add information to the genome. If they want to say it's the number of functional genes, we can show study after study of organisms that have evolved novel genes. Is it genome size? That too is easy to show increasing. Just look at the evolution in the 1990s of Procambarus virginalis from Procambarus phallax via whole genome duplication, resulting in a 50% bigger genome. Is it anatomical complexity? That seems unlikely, since all the animals shown have the same parts. In fact, if anything, the dingo should be higher, because being a feral dog, it actually has a few extra facial muscles that other canines lack that allow them to have a more expressive faces to better communicate with humans. So that, in and of itself, demonstrates the ability of the canine lineage to get more complex morphologically. This is the problem with the information argument. The minute it becomes a real argument, that is, the word information is given a clear definition, the argument is easily refuted. That's why creationists are so vague with it. Also, I want to point out that the relationship between the pictured canines is not that each one evolved into the next. The cladogram would actually look more like this.
And then as dogs breed, and we have, over 500 different dog breeds today.
Dog breeds have artificially low genetic diversity compared to wild animals because humans are incredibly restrictive in their breeding pool. They are a poor example organism for evolution because of how strange humans have made their morphologies and breeding pools. Basically, dogs have been humans' genetic playthings for thousands of years, and it shows.
You could definitely say that from the original kind of dog to a poodle, there's been a loss of information.
Only if by loss of information we mean that the genetic diversity of poodles as a breed is lower than that of all non-dog wolves. But again, mutation of logical necessity raises genetic diversity. So, if that's what is meant, that means that increasing the information is trivial for evolution. This kind of negates the whole information argument.
Right? Would we all agree, right?
No.
Clearly a loss of genetic information.
How so? Do poodles have fewer genes than wolves? Dogs and wolves both have about 2.4 megabase genomes. They have the same basic anatomy, with that of the poodle even being a bit more complex with extra facial muscles. If anything, I'd say that by having more muscles in its body, the poodle seems to have more information than the wolf. But then, of course, we still don't have a definition for information that would let us quantify the different amounts of information in any two organisms.
Or if you think from the original cat kind or a lion to a house cat, there's a loss of information here.
Why? because house cats are smaller? What if I say lions have less information because they can't purr on both the inhale and exhale, while domesticated cats can? If it's size, does that mean that the mastiff has more information than the wolf? Since wolves max out at about 81.5 kilos, but mastiffs max out at about 104? Do the Dutch, with their average height of nearly 176 centimeters, have more information than the Han Chinese, with their average height of 161 centimeters? Is it just that animals that are domesticated have less information arbitrarily? When does this begin? Do captive populations of leopard geckos have less information, even if they're wild type, than do their captive relatives in Iran, Pakistan, and India?
And this is natural selection.
Excuse me, the did you just say?
Both domesticated dogs and domesticated cats are primarily examples of artificial selection. You know, because they're domesticated.
We can directly observe this in the animal populations as we do see change within animal kinds.
Yes, and if that change comes from a change in allele frequencies across generations, then it's evolution by definition, since that is what evolution is, whether or not universal common ancestry is true.
But it is always a loss of information.
If we can't measure the information, we can't tell if it's a loss of information. And we already saw that at least all the obvious options for measuring information don't work, whether it be anatomical complexity, genome size, or gene number.
What does evolution require?
A population of organisms that can reproduce with genetic material can mutate. That's it.
Evolution requires a gain of information.
It doesn't by any definition, and since there is no definition, then I'm going to say that evolution requires a gain in information the same way that Christianity requires a gain in confirmation, which is a word I just made up and will not define. But unless you can convince me that confirmation is going up in each Christian, then sorry, but Christianity is just false.
It requires an organism to literally, miraculously gather new information and then become a different organism.
So, whatever information is, creationists always talk about it as if it's part of the genome. So, it's in the DNA, which is subject to mutation. What prevents mutations that add to the information of the organism? Did that notothenoid fish gain information when it got a new protein without losing an old one? Did dogs gain new information when they evolved 2 new facial muscles? What would prevent mutations which would increase information? And if information is in the genome, then it's not gathered miraculously or not, it's generated at the level of the DNA. No miracle required, just chemistry. This isn't the creature stage of spore. But also, this isn't a requirement of evolution. Any population of organisms that can reproduce and whose genetic material can mutate will of necessity evolve, even if only at the molecular level and not the morphological level.
This has never been observed in nature, ever.
Just like I've never observed a Christian increasing their confirmation, which, I have to say, it is a pretty serious blow to Christianity. I'm not sure how the church will recover. I mean, I might need to call like Pope Francis, Pope Tawadros, and Patriarch Bartholomew, and like for Protestants, Joel Osteen? I don't know. I gotta tell them the jig is up.
We see loss of information, yes, and we would agree there is natural selection within created kinds.
Maybe we see that, but how would we know?
But there is absolutely never been any living thing that has gained new information and become a completely different organism that would be required for evolution.
You know, this comes up a lot with creationists, where they will require as evidence of evolution things that would in fact go a long way to disconfirming evolution, or describe evolution in a way that actually ends up being more like special creation than like evolution. We've already talked about monophyly, but it means that fundamentally organisms do not just transition into completely different organisms. Vertebrates stay vertebrates, mammals stay mammals, apes stay apes. That's why humans are vertebrates, mammals, and apes. Evolution proceeds by variation on what is already there. To have a vertebrate turn into like a crustacean or something would violate the most basic aspects of evolution, and if it were found, it would be a strong evidence against evolution.
Mutations, everything that we see in creation as effects of the fall are all a loss of genetic information.
So, when E. coli in the Lenski long-term experiment duplicated an entire region of their genome, allowing them to digest citrate in the presence of oxygen, that was a loss of information. That seems unlikely to me, since they didn't lose anything, not even DNA. They kept their ability to digest it in the absence of oxygen. I guess you could say they lost the inability to digest citrate in the presence of oxygen, but I think everyone can see why that's a stupid way to phrase it.
So once again, do animals change? Yes, and we can see that change, but it's within these created kinds. It's within these genetic barriers, imagine, that God put in place as described in Genesis chapter 1 that prevents animals from gaining information and reproducing outside their created kinds.
Well, that's one hell of a sentence. We have two completely undefined terms, kind and information, and a whole new concept of genetic barriers that prevent creatures from gaining information, which again was not defined. You see, this yet again is why Christianity must be false, because they can't gain conflammation and cross into a new hyperdime because of the divine barrier. Sorry, Christians, but we all know that the only one who can be the origin of conflammation is Ahura Mazda, and he also already created all the hyperdymes after his first argument with Angra Mainyu. That's it, there's no more conflammation you can get with your whole worshipping Jesus thing. Best convince the Zoroastrians to once again start accepting converts, because that's your only hope.
So evolution and natural selection are not the same thing. They have two different definitions.
Yes, that's true. They're not the same thing in much the same way that an engine and a car are not the same thing. Of course, one is a vital component of the other, but technically, they're not the same thing, even if I just make up things that don't exist or that I can't describe or measure about cars.
Here's just one more example from biology. I love this one when I came across this image. Now, if you look at this image, you're probably going to say, wow, that kind of looks like a woven basket, doesn't it? That's what it looks like. Imagine like a basket under the microscope.
I thought of feathers, but then again, I like birds. So maybe I'm just biased. But those fibers are clearly not woven in an alternating pattern. So I definitely don't think of a basket.
Well, what this actually is an electron micrograph of tooth enamel.
Unironically cool.
And when they described it in the article, they actually said it looks like a woven basket. So teeth owe their strength and flexibility to the interweaving of mineralized rods.
Okay, is there a point? Or is this just, look at the trees, except it's teeth instead of trees? Cool thing doesn't on its own provide evidence for God just on the basis that it's cool.
Well, you know, it's not just tooth enamel that looks like a woven basket under the microscope. Our entire human body does.
I guess if she's talking about collagen fibers and cytoskeletons, then yes, that's true. Both are basically a bunch of crisscrossing fibers all over the place.
Our tissues look like a woven basket.
No, most of them are just sheets of cells.
You know, Psalms...
For a Christian here, Jen really sucks at the Bible. It's Psalm, singular, because it's a psalm from the book of Psalms. That name isn't just there as a goof. It actually describes the damn collection. And yeah, if she can't get the reference right, we're not listening to her Bible bit. She just points out that the psalm says that God knits people together in the womb, which apparently is profound because human tissue is woven together. Which, no, it's mostly not.
Now let's dive into a little bit of geology. Geology is a study of the earth.
That's the etymology, but more specifically, it's the study of Earth's history, physical structure, physical makeup, and the forces that shaped it and act on it. Meteorology also studies the Earth, just a different part. Geology is basically the study of rocks and minerals, how they form, how they got where they are now, and so on.
And here's what they found when we talk about fossils. Seashells have been found from shore to shore on mountaintops and places in between all over the world, and to the point where Mount Everest, at its summit, contains fossils.
Which on its own is actually a problem for a flood, because floods have to deal with this thing called gravity, which means that they tend not to really deposit things like fossils or sediments on top of mountains. Further, the Himalayas are made of folded rock from the area that was once between the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate. This means that the whole thing is made of marine sediments, including evaporites. Ever get that pink Himalayan salt? Yeah, that stuff is pink because of fossilized algae. And how do you get giant deposits of salt with algae? Well, a sea has to dry up. Pray tell, how does a sea dry up underneath a flood?
What event, right, does this directly confirm? The fact that we find seashells all over the earth and on the summit of Mount Everest.
The collision of the Indian plate with the Eurasian plate some 45 million years ago.
Genesis 7:18 through 19 clearly describes such event, right? It tells us that the waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth. All the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered.
It takes more than being covered in water to form fossils, especially to explain the fossil strata we see on Everest. Not only is there the aforementioned problem with evaporites, further, some of the fossil-bearing layers in the Himalayas are in situ, meaning that they grew and were fossilized where they lived as a community in an ecosystem. How do you even establish a functional ecosystem with generations of creatures on a mountain in a raging flood in under a year? Yeah, that's right. You can't. Simply noting that fossils exist on a mountain is far from sufficient to say that the fossils formed when there was a flood tall enough to cover the mountain, especially when the processes that form the Himalayas, that is, uplift from the buckling of the rock of the Indian and Eurasian plates, is still going on today, and we can watch it happen. Meaning that when we play it backwards, as expected, the rock that's up there now would be underwater, not because of a flood, but because of being below sea level.
So do we have a global event on this earth?
We've had a bunch of them, but so far all we've been shown to demonstrate that one of them was a global flood was stuff that actually argues against a flood if you bother to examine it for more than a few seconds.
Yes, we did. The Bible's clear about that.
Once again, the Bible isn't evidence in science. It's not data. If you want to support the Bible with your science, you can try, but you can't use the text itself to be evidence. You actually have to find physical evidence in the real world. Too bad for Ken Ham and his pals that when Christians actually started looking for evidence of the flood, they came back empty-handed.
All the mountains are covered up to 15 cubits deep. Should we expect to find marine fossils all over the face of the earth? Yes, we should.
Actually, no. Specifically, we shouldn't expect to find them in places like the tops of tall mountains, because they would have been swept away. And further, we shouldn't expect to be able to find deposits of fossils that are purely terrestrial. Yet, we do. In North America, we have the Morrison Formation, which is primarily a desert formation and has no marine fossils. There's also the Dakota Formation in Mongolia, which is similarly a desert formation with no marine fossils. If all these were actually flood deposits, then these terrestrial organisms would have been swept into the water along with all the fish from the ocean, and we should not have this type of segregation of terrestrial and marine organisms.
Right, we could make that prediction and clearly see how it confirms God's word.
Except that 1, the prediction is wrong because there are places we shouldn't expect to see marine fossils if the flood were true. But 2, even ignoring that, the prediction fails because there are also places that should have marine fossils if the flood is true that don't. This idea fails on both ends.
Now, here's something fascinating, too, when we look at fossils, is that, for a long time, I would say the narrative was out there that fossilization occurs very slowly. That's what secular scientists say, that an organism dies and it sinks to the bottom of a lake or river, and then it's slowly layered by sedimentary processes and pressure, and it's fossilized.
So, this is a vast oversimplification of fossilization in the sense of the replacement of the original biomaterial with mineral, that is, permineralization. More specifically, it happens at different rates in different conditions, and under some conditions it happens fairly quickly. But also, the rate at which an organism is covered in sediment can also vary, and the covering in sediment and the permineralization rate are not really tightly coupled, except that the permineralization has to be slower than the sedimentation because it can't happen in places that aren't covered in sedimentation. The sedimentation itself also has to happen more quickly than the decay rate, or there is nothing to be permineralized. But in some cases, all of this can happen fairly quickly, such as in an undersea sediment slump, which can trap organisms living at the bottom under multiple meters of muck that itself took millennia to deposit. This can form fossils in an area where sedimentation is normally too slow and decay removes organisms from the environment before they can be permineralized. On the other hand, at the bottom of an anoxic lagoon, where decay is glacially slow, even a slow deposition of silt can be well fast enough to allow for fossilization. Once an organism is covered, permineralization can start, and how long it takes varies, but it also isn't a factor in dating fossils. I should also point out that not all fossils are permineralized. Bones and shells are already basically made of rock, being biomineralized. Further, some fossils are actually not body fossils, but impressions left by a body, making them like a 3D version of a photographic negative. In these cases, there is simply no permineralization to worry about.
But that's not what we observe when something dies. As a forensic scientist, I can tell you, when something dies within 10 minutes of death, stuff's moving in to break that organism down.
Interesting. Jennifer is here saying that the processes we see today should inform our conclusions about the past. At the beginning of the talk, she said how it was something only so-called secular scientists did. But here, where she thinks it's convenient suddenly, the present is the key to the past. How does she know that this is how decay worked in the past, if we can't use the same logic with geology? Well, I guess when it comes to the triangle, we know that Jennifer didn't pick honest. But further, forensic science focuses primarily on what happens to human bodies in the conditions most likely to be encountered after criminal homicide. As you may be surprised to learn, those are not the same conditions that usually lead to fossilization. Most criminal people who unalive people, thank YouTube for ridiculous words I have to use, tend not to put people in places like anoxic lagoons, at the bottom of the ocean where they then trigger a sediment slump, out on the desert, etc. So, while Jennifer's hypocritical impulse to actually do science here, while condemning it elsewhere, is a good one, she is simply assuming that processes are the same under conditions we know to change those processes.
Right? We have insects moving in, we have other animals moving in.
Not if there's not enough oxygen. Or were they just buried under several meters of sediment, killing them too?
And that's part of God's, system that we see for decomposition.
Say hello to JTA240, a mummified human head that's approximately 6,000 years old, found in Argentina. Technically, this is a subfossil that is about 4,000 years away from being a true fossil. But I want to note that this time frame is far longer than we have available according to Jen's estimate, and it was simply found in the open, as are many desert mummies, because some environments are fundamentally unsuited to decomposers. Indeed, the first pre-dynastic Egyptian mummies were simply buried in the desert, and you are probably familiar with mummies of animals like woolly mammoths, which are indeed fossils. We also have mummies associated with Lake Natron in Kenya. It's trivially easy to find places today where Jen's assumptions about fossilization and decay are violated. And these are places where fossils are forming now. In fact, that mummified human head would have been a fossil if it had simply been found a bit later, rather than being found when it was.
But what they're noticing and starting to, I would say, is definitely out there in the narrative a lot, is that fossilization actually has to occur very rapidly. It doesn't take long periods of time to fossilize, and we've actually observed this.
That's true.
It doesn't have to take a long time. I'm not sure what this is an argument for, since fossils are not thought to be old because it takes a long time to form a fossil, although it can take longer than Jen is implying.
But if you look at this example here, we have just so many layers of detail in this particular fossil. We know it had to happen rapidly. And in this actual article, they were trying to say that these two creatures died together and sank and were slowly layered. I'm like, there is no way. Nature just doesn't work like that.
It observably does, though. So first, this fossil is from the Solnhofen limestone, a Lagerstätte, in Germany. And you may be surprised to learn that the nearly 2-decade-old link provided for this claim doesn't work. So I had to look up the fossil and find the PLOS paper it's from, which is linked in the description. That's also how I know where this fossil is from. Now, as the name might imply, the Solnhofen limestone is a biogenic limestone from the late Jurassic. Biogenic limestone has an observed maximum deposition rate of only a few centimeters per millennium. Theoretically, this could be sped up if there was a process of flocculation, but this would result in visible floccules in the sediment, which, you can see are not there, because the matrix surrounding the fossil is smooth, fine-grained limestone. During the late Jurassic, Europe was a chain of islands surrounded by a shallow sea of lagoons. The Solnhofen limestone formed in one such lagoon, which, because of how stagnant and murky it was at the bottom, had almost no free oxygen, making it anoxic. This happens in lagoons today. As a result, anything that died in the lagoon and sank to the bottom rotted extremely slowly, as the only decomposers that could get at them were anaerobic bacteria, which are extremely slow. So slow that the deposition of limestone from the bodies of algae was more than fast enough to cover these fossils. Again, this happens today in similar lagoons, although we don't have as many because the sea levels are much lower, meaning that we don't really have the same continent-spanning lagoon systems that were around in the Jurassic. So, if Jennifer is simply wrong in saying that this isn't how nature works, even though it's how it still works, but further, if she wants to say that this biogenic, non-flocculated limestone is the result of a flood, she's going to need the sedimentation experiments that allow for a flood to deposit limestone, such as the limestone forming the matrix of this fossil. Everything we know about the physics of sedimentation and water flow says that this is physically impossible. I wish her luck.
So what we have here is a fish, and in that fish's mouth is a pterosaur.
Specifically, this is a Rhamphorhynchus pterosaur, and the fish is Aspidorhynchus, a ganoid fish.
And when they did further scans of the pterosaur, they found that in its stomach is a little ostracod or shrimp.
Not according to the paper. The paper indicates that the gut contents of the Rhamphorhynchus are the remains of an unidentified and partially digested fish, and in the animal's throat are the mostly intact remains of another fish. Crustaceans are only mentioned as part of the potential identity of the animals found in the gut of the pteranodon, an animal found halfway around the world in North America. Ostracods are not mentioned anywhere in the paper. Why is she just lying about this? I really don't get it. Creationists are so sloppy. Like it wouldn't cost her any rhetorical points to just get this part right. But once again, we find a creationist getting stuff wrong that doesn't even matter. I get it that they have to lie about some things, like whether this rock could be a flood deposit, or when they create an absurd straw man of actual science. But then they'll just lazily make up things like this that don't matter, but that also undermine their credibility for no reason.
So here's what I imagine happens.
Oh good, I'll look into the mouth of madness.
The pterosaur wants lunch. It sees a shrimp in the water.
A fish. It was a fish. But okay.
The pterosaur is diving down to the water to scoop up the shrimp. He's successful. But then there's a bigger fish in the water that sees the pterosaur, grabs in its mouth, and then they had to have been immediately buried in sediment very quickly.
There are some problems with that. First, the fish is most of the way down the pterosaur's throat, which means that the pterosaur had to be swallowing, which implies it probably was not still in the water, since the lower jaw of Rhamphorhynchus seems to have been able to dip into the water without the rest of the body entering. Specifically because this is safer for the animal. This means that Aspidorhynchus probably leaped out of the water to get the pterosaur. It's actually not clear what killed the fish. But we know that this couldn't simply be a bunch of limestone sediment washing over them, because that's physically impossible for the bodies of algae to do. How did so much algae even come into existence at once? Remember, this is biogenic limestone. That means it's physically made of algae skeletons. As they reproduce, they bring in calcium from the seawater to build calcium carbonate shells. And as they die, the shell sinks to the bottom, forming limey muck, which eventually solidifies into limestone. Just having that much lime suspended in a column of water to then crash on the fish would be a problem, because it would be so thick that the algae that produced such sediment couldn't even grow, because there'd be no light for them. And of course, even if there were such a collection of sediment, it might drown the fish by clogging its gills. But the sediments are so small that just Brownian motion is enough to keep them suspended in the water for years, longer than the entire duration of the flood. So nothing about Jennifer's story is physically possible after the point where the fish grabs the pterosaur.
To get this level of detail, there's absolutely no way that a membranous pterosaur who has wings, that these organisms in a fish are going to sink, right? That's not going to happen when something dies, is they are going to float, and then they would have been ripped apart, especially because if they were in water.
That depends entirely on the relative densities of the animals. Now, for the pterosaur, that was pretty low, but we don't know that for the fish. Most fish in life are neutrally buoyant. the ones that you see floating in the fish tank post-mortem, are doing so because of decay gases. If what killed the fish broke the skin, then it's possible decay gases would not build up to an appreciable level, allowing it to sink. Further, we know that the decay processes in the area were much slower than we're used to because of the conditions in the lagoon that are needed simply to produce the limestone the fossils were found in. But further, if the problem she has is that the fish would have floated, then it's unlikely that unconsolidated limestone would have prevented that. So if this is a problem for science, it's equally a problem for her idea of a flood geology.
So we know they had to have been buried very quickly.
Well, I look forward to sedimentation studies that show the possibility of the rapid deposition of biogenic lime without flocculation. It will involve breaking fairly basic laws of physics, so I won't be holding my breath, but I'm sure it will happen eventually.
Well, how does this directly confirm God's word?
It doesn't.
Well, once again, we can go to Genesis. Genesis 7:11 tells us on that day,
God invented the Slurpee, and he drank the Slurpee which he had made, and he tasted that it was good.
all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So we have the crust of the earth breaking open.
Yeah, allowing the cosmic ocean below the flat earth to well into the earth without needing to displace air, of course, because in the Iron Age, no one knew that air was particulate matter that needed to be displaced.
And the windows of heaven were opened, and we know it rained 40 days and 40 nights.
Yeah, those windows in the dome over the flat earth that open to let in the waters of the cosmic ocean above the dome. You see why maybe taking Genesis literally is not so great an idea. There are no windows in the sky because the sky isn't a solid thing that can have windows in it.
So we have a catastrophic, cataclysmic event on this earth.
We have indeed had some of those. Unfortunately for Jen, a global flood wasn't one of them. And showing a fossil that a flood is physically incapable of producing isn't exactly a slam dunk bit of evidence for such an event.
Where we had large amounts of sediment accumulating very quickly. Imagine tsunami-type forces bearing millions of organisms in the level of detail that we can see in the fossil evidence.
You know, not everyone knows this, but tsunamis actually leave behind a special kind of rock. It's called tsunamite. They tend to be made of graded sand with floating mudstone clasts and hummocky, which basically means made of gentle bumps, cross stratification. Guess what? The limestone in the Solnhofen quarry lacks all of those features. So, what possible reason beyond wishful thinking could Jen have for saying that this rock is a tsunamite? You got it. None. In fact, it's not even made of sand. So that's a bit of a problem.
Another example where we see geology confirms the Bible is in the Mount St. Helen eruption.
Bold of her to use the word another.
We saw that in a single day, a canyon of over 150 feet deep was carved out.
Actually, I can't find any indication that this happened in a day, and there isn't even a canyon. Like, it's the system of gorges that have no common name around the Toutle River west of Spirit Lake at the foot of Mount St. Helens. It did happen rather quickly. This gorge, which you can see on screen is smooth-sided, is at most about 20 meters deep, and is all made from loose volcanic ash. The Grand Canyon is made of near vertical sides of hardened rock, including sandstone, shale, limestone, and deeper down, things like schist. The problem is that the gorge Jen is talking about, having been carved from what's basically dense powder rather than rock, has smooth sides and cannot support vertical slopes. That's what we see in the Grand Canyon. Many instances that are so vertical that one of the layers is called the red wall limestone, because of just how vertical it tends to be, and also because of the reddish dust it accumulates. The Grand Canyon cannot have been carved into powder, and so we have to deal with the erosion of already consolidated rock. And that's going to take a lot longer than a few days. Which is something you might know if you live near a river and have seen the same rocks in it for decades. Solid rock doesn't tend to simply erode away in days.
You know, because they try to tell us that, like, the Grand Canyon, for example, was carved out over a long period of time, right? That it took millions of years to carve out the Grand Canyon.
Well, it took more than 1,000,000, but by how much isn't super clear. It might have not taken 2,000,000 years. Broadly speaking, the Grand Canyon is a fairly recently created structure.
Well, we saw canyon formation, 1/40th the size of Grand Canyon, formed in a single day.
Well, if you want to call that little thing a canyon, then yes. But given the vast differences in the physical structure of the canyon and the differences in what the sides are made of, these formations are in fact not very analogous, beyond both being water erosion features.
Would Grand Canyon have formed very quickly? Yes, there's no question about it, and we've directly observed that.
Except we didn't. A gorge forming in fresh, unconsolidated ash is a worlds away from a canyon that was carved through, in some places, more than 1 mile of solid rock. But let's get to her other things when Dapper gets back. I don't want to do too much of his job for him. Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I'm back from that quick trip through the World Stone. When last you left off, Jennifer Hall Rivera was failing abysmally to show how geology somehow supported a global flood. You know, despite being the thing that finally disabused science of the notion. Now she has another way for us to know.
Now let's take a look at forensic science. Forensic comes from that word forensis, which means before the forum. So we're gathering knowledge to present before the forum. This was my area of specialty.
Hey, it's one of those pesky historical sciences, which means that we really can't know anything in there unless we approach it with a pre-drawn conclusion according to this particular pseudoscientist. So as we go through this, let's keep that in mind.
And so first I want to look at eyewitness testimony, because remember, forensic science, as I talked about earlier, is a historical science.
While eyewitness testimony can indeed be important, it is generally considered among the least reliable forms of evidence because it can be biased and human memory is notoriously unreliable. People can honestly remember an event in a way that differs significantly from how it actually happened, and can even remember things that never happened at all.
I go to a crime scene, I did not see that crime occur. So what are detectives going to do?
They're going to use the basic assumption of science that the universe doesn't vary in its behavior in the past. You know, the thing Jen spent most of the first video in the series complaining about.
Try to talk to someone who did, right? We want that eyewitness testimony.
Oh, and here I thought we were focusing on forensics, which is what you tend to do without an eyewitness. Especially since they get things wrong so often, whereas the data do not. But then, I guess the whole idea is a bit of a problem for young Earth creationists.
But the problem with eyewitness testimony, especially in humans, is that I can interview 10 people who observed the exact same crime, and you're going to get a completely different description about what that suspect was wearing or what color car they were in, because we are flawed, we're humans, we're imperfect, and our mind is not a camera. It can't take a photograph and remember that level of detail. We're influenced by the situation and the stress we're under. All these factors come into play when we observe an event.
Is she doing my job for me? I feel like she's doing my job for me. But yes, she is right about this.
So human eyewitness testimony is not accurate.
I wouldn't say that. It can be accurate, but it can also be inaccurate. That makes it unreliable, which isn't the same thing. If you have an unreliable friend, it means your friend sometimes come through and sometimes does not. Not that they don't come through in general.
And in fact, forensic science is hampered by our inability to reproduce the past. I love how this forensic pathologist described it. He said the most valuable asset we have in forensics is the testimony of a truthful witness.
Unfortunately, the only way to tell if they're being truthful is by looking at the data. Can what they said correspond to the physical state of the crime scene in question? Ideally, there are cameras which can clear up any mismatch, but in the absence of that, if someone says that they saw someone stabbed by a 7-foot-tall man, but the injuries on the 5-foot-tall victim are all blunt force injuries on the torso that seem to have come from a flat angle, then that witness simply isn't right, even if they're not lying. Because we know eyewitness testimony isn't reliable, and that reality is, we have to base our assessment of eyewitness statements on the physical data, not the other way around. Now, if the testimony doesn't contradict the data, then it can suggest solutions to otherwise insoluble questions, or suggest new avenues to examine for further data.
So you hope to talk to someone who can give you pretty much as accurate facts as possible when you're looking at an event that's unobservable.
But how do you vet the alleged eyewitness? Oh, right, you have to compare it to the physical data. So, for example, if your eyewitness seems to imply a bunch of biogenic limestone was laid down in a flood, but you happen to know that that's physically impossible, well, seems like the eyewitness is mistaken.
But some people may challenge us and say, well, how can we trust the Bible?
Good question, especially in cases where it is opposed to all the physical evidence we can find.
Right? How can we trust God's word? You're saying, man wrote down God's words, and if man's imperfect and we make mistakes, how can we trust what God's word says?
Nope. I don't really care about any of that. I care about the fact that if we interpret the book the way AIG does, then it is at odds with reality. It's no more at odds with reality than if it said that plants are red and the sky is yellow, and that stars are black dots in a white night sky.
But the Bible clearly tells us that it is the spoken word of God, that every word in the Bible is inspired.
It actually doesn't, but even if it did, we can't find the justification for taking the Bible the way AIG does, simply by looking at what the Bible says. That's why we call this circular reasoning. We can trust the Bible because it says we can, and we know that when it says that we can trust it, we can, because we can trust the Bible because it says we can. And we know that when it says that we can trust it, we can. See the problem there? No matter how many times your alleged eyewitness says, "Trust me, bro," we still have to test it against the actual evidence. After this, she just doubles down on the circular reasoning. Since that adds nothing to the discussion, I won't subject you to it.
Another example that we see in forensic science is what we call trace analysis or hair analysis. I can go to a crime scene, I can find a single piece of hair, and I can tell you right away whether it is from a human or whether it is from an animal. And what is so fascinating is when we look at it and know it's from an animal, we know exactly which animal kind it is from.
Well, first, no, you can't tell what kind it's from because there's no way to define kinds in the first place. But second, the fact that the hairs can be identified down to the species level isn't all that surprising. Further, I want to note that other than being in color or not, the image we're shown has primate fur and the human hair looking nearly identical. So I'm not sure this is the point Jen really wants to go with, but let's let her cook.
Because under the microscope, the cat kind looks different from the dog kind.
But does the carnivoran kind look different from the ungulate kind? Does the ferae kind look different from the Euarchontoglire kind? Does the Larazothere kind look different from the Afrothere kind? Does the marsupial kind look different from the placental kind? Does the monotreme kind look different from the therian kind? See the problem? That you can identify hairs down to the species level of necessity means that you can identify all the higher taxa to which that species belongs. But this in itself doesn't tell you anything about which groups constitute created kinds.
A single piece of fur. We can know whether it's from a horse kind, or the pet rabbit, or the pet ferret. So what we see is by created kinds, there's distinct different patterns. And these are just a few examples that you see here.
Is she suggesting that you can distinguish kinds by hair analysis? I mean, that's a new claim, and it's never actually been published even in the LARP journals of young Earth creationism. But I would be fascinated to see any more information on this and how this actually lines up with the idea of kinds, but violates common ancestry, since I'm not sure how it could. This would mean that, at least for mammals, anyone could do the analysis and they should always get essentially the exact same kinds. This would be an actual breakthrough in creation science, the first one ever, near as I can tell. Or she's just pretending that the fact that you can identify species from hair is somehow a brand new revelation, and is to be expected under either model. I wonder just how much difference it takes before you can say that a hair is from a different kind.
Directly confirming what God's word says about created kinds.
Are we not going to hear what the criteria are for distinguishing kinds by hair? We're just going to hear that we can? We haven't even gotten a citation for this.
And we're so valuable to God.
That according to AIG, he had to kill every last human but for 8, including all the infants with their evil infant ways?
That he knows the very number of our hairs at any time. I think that's just so amazing.
That just kind of comes free with omniscience, so it doesn't really matter if God cares about us or not. The only time such minutiae about something could indicate concern is if it takes effort to learn that. You see, people know I care about dinosaurs because I have to spend time learning about them. I don't simply know about them through osmosis. God, on the other hand, just knows everything automatically according to AIG. So that he knows how many hairs any given person has isn't actually a sign of any particular concern. It's almost like in Luke where this comes from. The actual analogy is that God keeps the birds and flowers alive and thriving, and he is so wise and knowledgeable and has already had a special relationship with humans that how could humans not feel like they can rely on God to provide for them?
Now, we also can see there's a distinct difference between what we see in not just in the hair samples of animals, but in humans as well, because we can get, especially if we get the hair follicle, we can get a DNA profile on that. We can actually distinguish an individual human from each other from a single piece of hair.
Does Dr. Jennifer Hall Rivera think that the follicles of other mammals besides humans don't have DNA? You can DNA profile any mammal this way. It's just that most places don't happen to have a databank of individual animal DNA profiles, but you can absolutely match an individual of any mammal species with DNA from their hair.
But the FBI recognizes that human hair and animal hairs are distinctly different as well. This is from their website where they say this characteristic serves to distinguish human hairs from animal hairs.
Funny thing, FBI 2019 isn't an actual reference. You know what happened when I searched this exact phrase both with and without FBI? It didn't show up. There was an article called Forensic Hair Comparison Background Information for Interpretation published by the FBI with some of the same keywords, but overall, yes, human hair is unique. All species have unique hair. However, while humans may have a unique scale pattern, which as their own species isn't horribly surprising, their hair medulla under scanning electron microscope falls in line with the great apes, and particularly close to chimpanzees. And of course, humans also do strange things to their hair, like washing it with soap, bleaching it, cutting it, etc. So there are also mechanical and chemical changes that humans do to their hair behaviorally that distinguishes it in a lab, but that are not a biological difference.
And they're referring to the imbricate pattern or the cuticle pattern that is on human hairs and animal hairs.
Almost. Humans and all mammals have scales on their hair, but only humans are known to have an imbricate pattern of the hairs. Other animals have other unique patterns, often being identifiable down to the species on this basis. So this puts humans on the same footing as all other mammals.
Now we're also going to take a look at fingerprints today.
Oh good, something humans share with other apes. But of course, each ape species has unique characteristics to their own digital dermal ridges.
Because we do see a distinct difference, because primates do have fingerprints.
It's not just that primates also have fingerprints, it's that only primates have fingerprints. Squirrels don't have fingerprints, dogs don't have fingerprints, cows don't have fingerprints. All species are unique within their wider group. The dhole of South and Central Asia has a different number of nipples compared to other canids. That doesn't make it not a canid, and even less not an animal. Among procyonids, only kinkajous have prehensile tails. Among apes, only orangutans have phalanges. Among toothed whales, only sperm whales can dive deep enough to feed on giant squid regularly. Among bats, only vampire bats can subsist on a diet of just blood. You know what none of that means? That these animals aren't animals, and even less that they aren't procyonids, hominids, or odontocetes. That's simply not how taxonomy works, and in cases other than humans, Jennifer knows this.
But what we find is there are animals that God gave unique fingerprint patterns to. It's not just restricted to humans.
But it is restricted to primates, along with having nails instead of claws, fully enclosed orbits, those weirdly flexible shoulder joints, etc. Why is it that every time we find a trait unique to primates, humans have it too? Could it be because humans are just primates? Like has been recognized since the time of Carolus Linnaeus. In fact, in places where other primates live, the kinship between humans and the other primates has been recognized for far longer. Just the name orangutan means old man of the forest, because they were recognized by the humans who lived near them as being in some way or another kind of the same thing that humans are. Numerous societies have origin myths that give primates a shared or similar origin to humans. Monkey gods tend to be associated with art and wisdom, things that are pretty characteristically human, according to many humans. Again, showing the ease with which humans recognize their kinship with other primates.
And so when we take a look at primate fingerprints, evolutionists like to say, oh, well, this is just evidence that we've descended from a common ancestor, right? They have friction skin, we have friction skin, and they have fingerprints, and we have unique fingerprints.
That's true.
But what we find is when we study primate fingerprints versus human fingerprints is that they are distinctly different. And there's lots of research out there about this. They're clearly different from humans.
The citation used for this is listed simply as Henneberg et al. 2015. Now that's the kind of citation that's fine for an inline citation with a works cited section somewhere else in your publication. But in this format, where there is no works cited page, either in the video or in the original video description, that is completely inadequate. Searching for papers by someone named Henneberg with both fingerprints and fingertips from 2015 yielded Cyanobacterial diversity in biological soil crusts along a precipitation gradient northwest Negev Desert, Israel. That's it. I'm pretty sure that's not what she's referencing. Searching without the keywords also popped up, are human faces unique, a metric approach to finding single individuals without duplicates in large samples. Understanding configurations of relational attractiveness of the customer firm using fuzzy set QCA. An empirical investigation of network-oriented behaviors in business-to-business markets. Biological plausibility as a tool to associate analytical data of micropollutants and effects potentials in wastewater, surface water, and sediments with the effect in fishes. If you compress the spring, will it snap hard? The Ukrainian crisis and the balance of threat theory. The difficulty of sexing skeletons from unknown populations. The life history of Ardipithecus ramidus, a heterochronic model of sexual and social maturation. Intercognitive representations in business networks. When stress frustrates and when it does not. Configural models of frustrated versus mellow salespeople. And it goes on like this for more than 2,000 entries. Now clearly some of these are closer to what we're looking for, and those works are the works by a certain M. Henneberg. But his only paper in 2015 is The Immune System and Responses to Cancer Coordinated Evolution. This is clearly not what we're looking for. In fact, nothing he has written that I can find is about fingerprints. Searching the exact quotation, on the fingertips the ridges form distinct tented arch patterns, which are clearly different from human ones, turns up no results on Google Scholar from the year 2000 all the way to 2023. The conclusion I am forced to come to is that this citation simply doesn't exist, and this is the second one in a row. Now, I'm not saying Dr. Jennifer Hall Rivera is a fucking liar, but I am saying that it appears she is a person who says intentionally false statements. And of course, even if this is an accurate citation from a real paper, which it doesn't seem to be, once again, we're just at the argument that humans are unique among primates and therefore are not primates, which makes no sense.
And primates also have what's called a higher ridge density than humans, and what that means is...
You gotta love 80-year-old citations, but okay, let's see if this is a traceable source, even though it's laughably badly cited. Well, in 1942, the wrong year, Harold Cummins wrote a review of dermatoglyphic work in the Journal of Mammalogy, so it seems that this is the Cummins we're looking for. Neither Google Scholar, SciSpace, nor Wikipedia list any publications for Cummins in the year 1943, although they do for 1942 and 1944. Searching for the quote in quotations to find any site with the exact words yields nothing on Google Scholar and nothing on regular Google, which as a result simply shows results for the search without quotations. Interestingly, the first thing that pops up there is from Answers in Genesis. It's an article by Jennifer Hall Rivera, published January 1st, 2019, called Close But Not Close Enough, Fingerprints. And it's apparently a reprint of an Answers magazine article. Of course, the article has no citations, but does say, scientists have observed that the ridges in human fingerprints have a higher density than in primate fingerprints, since primates have finer ridges that have many more per centimeter, 22 average, than humans, 11 average. Now, first, I would wonder how much of this has to do with the fact that among primates, humans are among the biggest, as are all hominids. My guess is that if you scaled a pygmy marmoset fingerprint up, you'd get a lot fewer ridges per centimeter. But also, what scientists have observed this? Where do they publish it? I don't know, so I guess back to the drawing board. I'm still not saying Dr. Jennifer Hall Rivera is a liar, but it's harder and harder to not conclude that she is a person who says intentionally false things. At least in this case, we can be pretty well assured that the person she's pretending to cite actually did work on hand and footprints, including finger and toe prints. The last place I checked was for Hall Rivera's publications in the Answers Research Journal or the Creation Research Society Quarterly. Because maybe if she published there on fingerprinting, she would have a proper citation. But of course, she has no publications in either. So for the third time in a row, we get an argument that would fail if it's true, but that also relies on a source that by all appearances traces itself not back to a real publication, but rather to the results of Hall Rivera's most recent enema.
Is that those individual ridges on a primate are thinner, so they just have more of them.
If only English had a phrase for this sort of thing. Oh yeah, it does. That's a difference of degree, not of kind. Thanks, English.
Primates have about 22 ridges per centimeter, while humans have about 11 ridges per centimeter, just because our ridges are thicker.
Oh hey, that claim that comes from her own non-peer-reviewed magazine article. Sure would be nice to get a real citation.
But it's one of those distinct differences that we do see.
According to basically this one person here, but I repeat again, pointing out how humans are unique among primates doesn't make them not primates. Tyrannosaurus rex was bigger than any other tyrannosauroid, which by this logic makes it not a tyrannosauroid. But this works for any animal. Basically, if we took this argument seriously, not only would it separate humans from apes, it would separate gorillas from apes. It would separate tigers from felines. it would turn every single species back into a separate creation, the original position of creationists.
Should we expect to see differences?
Yes, both evolution and creationism predict that humans will not be the same as other species. I mean, if they were, then wouldn't that make them just the same species as the other one they're identical to? Pointing out that a certain taxon is unique among larger taxa to which it belongs doesn't indicate anything that is a problem for evolution, since the whole reason you split larger taxa, like hominid, into smaller taxa, like genera such as gorilla, pan, or homo, is because those lower taxa are themselves unique. This is simply how taxonomy and evolution work. As new branches grow on the tree of life, they get less and less similar to other branches to which they are connected as time goes on. That's also why members of various taxa look more similar as we look back in time. Today, equids and tapiromorphs are easily distinguished, the former being horses, zebras, and donkeys, and the latter being rhinos and tapirs. But if you look at our earliest fossil equids and tapiromorphs, it requires high degrees of expertise on tooth anatomy to distinguish them, because they're otherwise essentially identical. Similarly, our earliest Sirenian and our earliest Proboscideans are extremely similar. Well, similar enough that if you didn't know that one was the earliest manatee or dugong, and that the other was the earliest elephant, you'd probably say they should be in the same kind according to creationists. If horses and rhinos persist for another few million years, something that is pretty iffy, especially for the rhinos, then I'm sure that their descendants will look even less like each other than their modern ancestors. And yet, they'll still remain parasodactyls, odd-toed ungulates.
Well, the Bible tells us in Genesis 1:24 that God said he created all living things according to their kind, so we can be confident knowing that primates are only going to produce more primates.
As required by evolution. Also, are we now saying that primate is a kind? Are chimpanzees in the same kind as the slow loris or bush baby? I mean, if that's the case, it's going to be really hard to keep humans out of that kind, because all the apes are far more similar to humans than they are to, say, ring-tailed lemurs.
And that humans, Genesis 1:26 says, are made in the image of God.
So, why is God monkey? But seriously, if you're a person who believes in the Imago Dei, you're allowed to just say that it is something imbued in some monkeys a few 100,000 years ago, and that rather than being a physical similarity, since, most Christians tend to think that God has no body in his essence, it's about moral standing, creative ability, rationality, etc. I'm not really here for theology. I'm just saying you can make your theology far less dumb than AIG's and keep things like belief in God, the Imago Dei, the Incarnation, etc., all without denying science.
Right? We are distinct and set apart and given a dominion over God's creation.
I wonder if that dominion grant should make Christians concerned for things like the environment and the well-being of other living things which the Bible places under them as wards and subjects. It's almost like maybe AIG should stop being climate skeptics and instead actively work to spread awareness about the problems faced by the non-human parts of the living world. But nah, that's not right-wing enough. They know that their fans love oil and don't think carbon dioxide could ever be a problem. And heck, if Jesus is coming back anyway, why worry about the livability of the planet for other organisms? Never mind humans.
Another difference we see in forensic science is in gait. Now, these is that Laetoli footprints I was talking about earlier that you should definitely go check out when you're in the Lucy exhibit today. But when you take a look at those Laetoli footprints, for a long time they were trying to say this was this primate.
Yep, it's a primate no matter how human it is, because humans are primates, just like they're mammals or vertebrates. Something that, curiously, I've never heard Answers in Genesis deny.
Early ancestor of humans, that image I showed you earlier. But what's interesting now is we can look at this and we can clearly see these are human.
That's weird, because they're actually intermediate between the footprints left by habitually unshod humans and chimpanzees walking bipedally. And in 2021, McNutt et al. Found that they were distinctly not human in footprint evidence of early hominin locomotor diversity at Laetoli, Tanzania, as did Meldrum et al. In 2011 in their paper Ichnotaxonomy of Laetoli Trackways, the earliest hominin footprints. Same for Tuttle et al. In their 1991 publication, Laetoli toes in Australopithecus afarensis.
Right, they have a heel-toe strike. That's how humans walk. We can also see that the feet are slightly pointed out. You've never noticed, you should take a look when you're walking, your feet slightly point out, just like this. That is because of our skeletal structure.
Yes, the footprints do have many similarities to human footprints, almost like Australopithecus afarensis is related to modern humans and shares many biomechanical adaptations with modern humans to facilitate bipedal upright locomotion. But also, Hatala et al. In the 2016 paper Laetoli Footprints reveal bipedal gait biomechanics different from those of modern humans and chimpanzees, we find that they're actually unique. A conclusion shared by White and Sua in the 1987 paper Hominid Fossils at Laetoli, Facts and Interpretations. And of course, Raiklen et al. In the 2010 paper Laetoli Footprints preserve earliest direct evidence of human-like bipedal biomechanics. Unlike in the AIG video, my sources are in the description, and even if they weren't, by giving year, author and title, you could just find them in a quick Google Scholar search. Nice how, unlike some people in this video, I'm not hiding my sources, isn't it?
Primates don't walk like that.
Well, Australopithecus afarensis manifestly did, and Hall Rivera thinks they're primates, so yes they do. Just not most of them. In fact, all primates have a known tendency towards at least occasional bipedal locomotion. It's the default for grounded hylobatids, and in many lemurs it has changed to a bunny hopping motion on the ground, but it remains bipedal. Even other apes are known to walk bipedally while carrying things in their arms, or sometimes just to get a view from a higher vantage point than their knuckle walking stances would normally permit.
Primates walk with their feet straight because they have a different pelvic structure.
Oh hey look, it's the pelvic structure of Australopithecus afarensis that has that nice intermediate pelvic structure that allows for bipedal locomotion. There's nothing like lying about extinct primates to help you overturn basic level observations about fossils.
Well, when we take a look at this, it's the Smithsonian Institute, I found this on their website, they're actually starting to admit that, yeah, these early impressions that we see here look a lot like human feet.
Well, yeah, they do look human. That's why they're significant. That's literally the whole point. But I already cited a bunch of articles pointing out that they're definitely not human. But hey, let's check our source, which this time actually has a full title, year, and even URL. The URL is wrong, but not by much. And what do you know? The first sentence is, quote, "The Laetoli footprints were most likely made by Australopithecus afarensis, the early human whose fossils were found in the same sediment layer," end quote. So when the article says human, it included Australopithecus in that category, something that Jen here would not be okay with, and at no point does it even hint that these footprints are identical to those left by Homo sapiens. I guess now we know why she so rarely bothers to properly cite things, because apparently creationism tends to follow the first law of Flurfs. Flurf citations always contradict the Flurf claim. Yet more evidence to throw on the pile that creationists are no better than flat earthers.
For a long time, they didn't want to admit they were human because if in a secular timeline, it didn't fit their evolutionary ideas.
No, it's because they're not made by Homo sapiens, something all the peer-reviewed literature confirms. But Jen here did manage to find an article that calls Australopithecus a human, and then says that the footprints are human, in that they were made by Australopithecus. Which means, yeah, I am now comfortable in saying that Jen is a liar, because her own citation is only about 5 paragraphs long, and there's no way she didn't notice this if she read it. This is a classic example of a quote mine in creationism.
But we look at these footprints and go, yes, they're clearly human, and they could not be older than about 4,500 years, which would have been the time of the global flood.
Ah yes, when you decide you already know the conclusion, and then you just close your eyes, stick your fingers in your ear, and start screaming the words to Hillsong worship music. You can easily ignore all the evidence that you're very wrong from actual experts, and instead rest easy in your own ignorance and dishonesty. But at least you don't have to think deeply about things like science.
They said they have highly divergent toes that help them climb in grass. They're referring to primates.
Oh good, more from the article that clearly says that Australopithecus is being called a human for the purposes of this article, meaning that it flatly contradicts the point Jen is making, that these footprints are made by modern humans in contrast to Australopithecines. Fun times.
They say the footprints also show the gait of these early humans,
by which they explicitly mean Australopithecus afarensis.
Was heel strike the way modern humans walk.
Yes, Australopithecus walked with heel strikes first, which is how modern humans walk, which is evidence that humans share ancestry with non-human apes. All she's doing is showing evidence for evolution, but because she found a short article doing this while calling things she thinks are just apes human, she can lie to her audience as this is evidence against that very thing.
So they're trying to say, well, could still maybe have been a transitional, but it's a lot more human-like, right?
No, they're literally and clearly saying in a way I refuse to believe this PhD is too stupid to understand that the animal she is saying did not leave these human-like footprints, in fact did leave them, indicating that the predicted transition between basal apes and modern humans in fact exists, and that Australopithecus is an example of such a transition. In addition, I have already cited some half dozen of the hundreds of papers on these footprints that conclude that they were impossible to have been left by Homo sapiens, and instead, despite their similarities with the footprints of that species, were in fact consistent with the biomechanics of Australopithecus afarensis. I don't really think it's necessary, but in case you're wondering, numerous citations from paleoanthropologists and experts in biomechanics and ichnofossils trump a blurb on a few paragraphs on the Smithsonian website. But you know what? Let's toss in another study. Rakelin and Gordon's 2017 paper, Interpretation of Footprints from Site S Confirms Human-like Bipedal Biomechanics in Laetoli Hominins, confirms that the prints were in fact intermediate between chimpanzee and modern humans, although leaning closer to human, and that the footfalls indicated that they were incompatible with Homo sapiens foot morphology, but that they were compatible with known remains of foot bones from Australopithecus afarensis.
Clearly human when we look at these, and you can almost see smaller footprints walking next to the larger ones as you see here.
Yep, the interpretation is generally that the trail was left by a male and female walking with each other more or less in lockstep. The smaller set of prints are also deeper on one side, which has been seen as an indication that she may have been carrying an infant on her hip.
Genesis 1:26 says, God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, right? Humans are distinct, set apart. We walk upright.
But so do the Australopithecines, according to the source she herself cited. I guess humans aren't all that set apart.
And our gait, that we call it, the way that we walk, is distinctly different. That's exactly what we'd expect to see.
Yes, that seems fair. What creationists should expect to see is humans having a unique gait that sharply separates them from things that she would consider to be apes, just like Australopithecus afarensis. Too bad all 7 of my peer-reviewed citations and her 1 non-peer-reviewed citation all say that's not what's happening.
So let's look a little bit at biochemistry today. Bio means life, chemistry means cast together. So we're kind of looking at molecular processes in living organisms.
Okay, I guess it's time to fit in another topic with just over 6 minutes left in the talk.
And the first one I just briefly want to touch on is DNA. Now, part of that DNA project we talked about, one of the conclusions that they found was that humans do share 99% of their DNA. 99% of the DNA in this room is exactly the same.
Yeah, you would expect the members of the species to have a lot of DNA in common, although humans are a bit less diverse than typical.
Why? Because we are one human race.
I think it's more the other way around, because humans have relatively low genetic diversity. There's no way to divide them into races with any objectivity. But hey, if the message is that races are fake and racism is stupid, I'm on board.
Directly confirming what God's word told us about the creation of humans.
I could point out that the modern concept of human races was actually invented largely by Christians who used Genesis to justify it as an excuse as to why it wasn't a horrible injustice for them to hold slaves primarily from Africa. That would be uncharitable, though.
Acts 17:26 goes, He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth.
You mean the book that was written as a polemic against the gods of Mesopotamia with superlative language about the God of Israel credits that very same God with the creation of humanity as part of its polemic? Wow! Who could have predicted this? It's still not empirical evidence.
That's exactly what we would expect to see. We are one human race. We are all image bearers of the Creator God, sharing 99% of our DNA.
I have no argument here. This is a Christian belief I'm fine with. Sure, you can't back up the Imago Dei scientifically, but it's not a scientific claim, so sure, whatever. It also discourages racism, which I'm a fan of. I'm also not endorsing it.
Now, our DNA is found inside our eukaryote cells in the nucleus, and we're talking about nuclear DNA.
Yep, rather by definition, nuclear DNA is in the nucleus.
Our chromosomes, which are found in the nucleus of our cells, as you can see here, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 23 from mom, 23 from dad, 46 total. If we could take that chromosome out of the nucleus and we could say, well, what is this chromosome made up of? We would find that a chromosome is tightly coiled DNA. So imagine you could uncoil it, kind of like a slinky that's compressed. You're going to stretch out that slinky and kind of lay it flat. We would see that the chromosomes are made of sections of genes that make up that DNA strand.
Saying that a chromosome, which by the way has 2 M's, not an M and an N, despite how Jen is pronouncing it, is made of genes is kind of like saying that the human body is made of fingernails. That's part of it, but if you just say that's it, you're missing the majority of it. The majority of chromosomes is things that aren't genes, like ALUs, exons, telomeres, centromeres, actual junk, etc. In fact, only about 3% of the human genome is genes, meaning that on average a chromosome will be about 3% genes. Now, that's not to say that that's the only part doing anything. The genome isn't genes and then useless nonsense.
Well, our genes are those traits that make us unique. Our hair color, our eye color, our skin shade. That's all genetic information.
Please, creationists, please, I'm begging you, at least get a high school level understanding of genetics. Genes code for proteins. Traits are the phenotypic expression of genes, and variations in genes are alleles. This isn't that hard to figure out. These are all very basic vocabulary words that even in my Christian high school got drilled into us in biology class. To be fair, my school wasn't a creationist school, and my biology teacher wasn't a Christian, so perhaps my Christian education was unusual. In fact, a decent portion of the teachers were either not Christians or belonged to another group of Christians than the one that ran the school. Turns out that the school was actually not discriminating based on religion, which is nice.
On sections of DNA that are tightly coiled into our chromosomes that are found in the nucleus of our cells. Well, what we see here is a very orderly process. We see what's called the code of life. That's what they call DNA. It's called the code of life.
I've never heard it called that, but I guess it's an okay thing to say as long as you know you're being figurative.
Have you ever seen a code?
Yes.
A computer code?
Do you always look at it and code it?
Well, you have to. The image translators work for the construct program. but there's way too much information to decode the matrix. You get used to it. I don't even see the code. All I see is blonde, brunette, redhead.
A language, sometimes DNA is called the language of life. Have you ever seen anything that didn't have a programmer behind it, an author behind it?
Yes, every natural language. Natural languages weren't designed by some guy. Now, you can design a language if you want to. That's how things like Quenya, Klingon, and Esperanto came about. But languages like English, Amharic, and Quechua were not designed. They somewhat ironically evolved in a way that is very similar to biological evolution, complete with change over time and common ancestry. Further, when it comes to computer code is written by AI now, and again, ironically, can be and is written by genetic algorithms, which means that the code is not designed and is instead simulated in a way that is set up to directly mimic natural selection and mutation.
No. What we see is we see complete orderliness, a complexity in DNA that we still don't completely understand.
Complexity is not an argument for design. In fact, complexity is usually avoided to the maximum extent possible by designers. Keep it simple, stupid is a saying for a reason.
And people want to say it's a result of random chance processes?
Yep, because we can routinely watch complexity arise in the wild in laboratory experiments with model organisms and in simulation in computers without a designer, and from a combination of random mutations and selection and drift. It's almost like this is part of that operational science that Jen pretends to love so much.
We've never seen that.
Yeah, we've never seen TooManyDemons reinhardti evolve multicellularity in a lab. You know, except for that time around 2018 when Boyd et al. Reported in the paper Analysis of Motility in Multicellular TooManyDemons reinhardti evolved under predation. Or, you know, that time we watched bacteria evolve a whole new enzyme called nylonase to, you guessed it, digest nylon. Or that time some E. coli in the Lenski long-term evolution experiment evolved an entirely new metabolic pathway to digest citrate in the presence of oxygen. Seems like we have seen complexity in organisms increase. I'd also mention the antifreeze glycoprotein in notothenioid fish, but I already talked about that in this series.
It's a very exact code.
Compared to what?
Bases pair and align perfectly in the DNA code of life.
Yep, chemistry does indeed continue to work as expected in the nucleus of a cell.
In fact, the information in just one human cell, the DNA information, you could fill 700 college-level biology textbooks worth of information.
So, wait. So now information isn't the size of an organism or the anatomical complexity of an organism, it's just how much data it takes to write down all the base pairs in the genome? Okay, so anytime the genome size increases, that's an increase in information. Neat. That means that information verifiably can increase through mutation, because any mutation that increases total genetic material is definitionally an increase in information. And insertion and duplication mutations are quite common. That's cool. Also, the human genome is 6.27 gigabase pairs, which means that since there are only 4 base pair options, each base pair can be completely encoded in just 2 bits. That means that the amount of information in the human genome is 1.57 gigabytes. That means that you can fit more than 38 human genomes in the same space on your hard drive that the 2022 From Software game Elden Ring takes up. For a big number, therefore God argument, this number isn't even that big.
Organized information.
Hey, did you know that the ordering of genes can itself have fitness effects and can change via mutation, and therefore that the organizational structure in the genome can actually evolve via natural selection? Neat, isn't it?
Well, who could be the author and life giver to that very orderly, complex code?
Well, there's no reason to think it demands an author, but I'm going to go with Lord Xenu. Just don't try to remember him yourself, or you might get pneumonia. After this, we just get more of the Bible tells me so. I don't care because, once again, not empirical.
Now, if we take a look at the human chromosomes, those 23 pairs that we talked about, the first 22 are numbered, as you can see here. That is our genetic information, our different characteristics. That last pair of chromosomes, the 23rd pair, is not numbered. You can see here that it has a letter and it has an X, and we can see 2 chromosomes on top of that X.
Why do I feel like this is about to get transphobic?
Now, this also directly confirms what we see in God's Word. Right? This is called the gender chromosome or the sex chromosome.
I've never heard them called gender chromosomes, but okay. Also, it's not really surprising that the Bible talks about the origin of male and female humans, because basically every creation myth accounts for sex differences in humans.
So if there are 2 chromosomes on the X, this is a female profile.
Typically, but then again, the SRY gene on the Y chromosome that is generally determinative of sex has been known to occasionally cross over onto an X chromosome, resulting in XX males. Additionally, extra androgens in utero, such as testosterone, can result in XX individuals that appear morphologically male, or intermediate between male and female conditions.
And if we see an X, one on X and one on Y, then we know that is a male profile.
Well, again, because the Y chromosome can in fact lose the SRY gene, either from crossing into an X or just a mutation that breaks it, and because only one X chromosome is needed for life, and the Y chromosome is not necessary for an embryo to come to term, there can indeed be humans who are XY females. Additionally, things like androgen insensitivity can cause an XY individual, even one with a perfectly functional Y chromosome, with a functional SRY gene, to be born as either morphologically female or with an intersex condition. Now granted, these things are fairly uncommon, but they also can't simply be ignored, because the people who are born like this are real living humans with their own lives, relationships, families, hopes, and dreams. They count, they matter, and pretending they don't exist is only harmful to them.
There are not 400 genders like you may see on the news today.
And that's where they go full-on transphobic. So let's get into the word sex and gender a bit. Originally, sex referred to the differences between male and female, but in English, that word came to be regarded as vulgar after it started being used to refer to the act of intercourse. Similarly, the words gender from the Latin genus was borrowed into English to describe the noun categories that many languages use that affect the morphology of words that modify that noun. In most European, as well as most Afro-Asiatic languages, these groups of words had one category that generally contained most words specifically referring to male humans and animals, and in some cases things associated with them, and another that grouped together female humans, animals, and things associated with them. Things that were in neither category naturally tended to get assigned to one or the other based on whether the word itself sounded like it belonged to one category or the other category. This is what gender meant originally in English. Because, however, the word sex was increasingly seen as crude, the word gender was used as a euphemism for sex. Now, much more recently, the need was recognized to have a verbal shorthand way to refer to biological realities of reproductive groups in humans, and distinguish it from the societal norms that are traditionally placed on members of those groups, but which are not biologically inherent to them. For example, Western societies generally allow for females to wear dresses, but not males. But there is no biological function making such clothing more appropriate for females than males, and males who wear such clothing suffer no necessary injury for doing so, even if in some areas they may be subject to unnecessary injury from assholes who associate with ideologies like that of Answers in Genesis. These societal norms were deemed genders, while the biological aspects were regarded as sex. This is indeed a recent addition to the language. The first time the distinction was drawn was in 1945, but it wasn't until a decade later that there was anyone really advocating for people to draw the distinction. Since then, the distinction has been spreading from academia into common parlance, but most adults today are still people who grew up when in common use, gender was basically a synonym for sex. Now, there is some sense to the idea that there simply are not as many genders as an individual cares to make up. And this idea has even waned in the conversation from the trans rights side, of late. You know, the side that isn't trying to remove basic human rights from people. The reason is that genders are social categories, and as such, importantly, if a society doesn't have a category that is broadly recognized per se, then it's not a social category. Generally speaking, Western society has two genders, man and woman, and people can fall into one or neither category by either recognition of others or by self-identification or both. As a matter of basic decency, I suggest that people make an effort to recognize people as falling into the gender they self-identify with. Now, it could be argued that within the neither zone, which I am taking to include non-binary and gender-fluid individuals, one could come up with a nigh infinite number of gradations. The problem is that none of them are generally recognized as of now, and so can't really be called genders as such, even though these nuances of identity are real and should not simply be ignored. Now, after this, Jen continues to be bigoted and pretend that what trans people think they're doing is changing their chromosomes and refusing to acknowledge the fact that they are making a distinction between sex and gender, which she may not like, but there is a real semantic difference between the words as the trans people and allies whom she hates use them. I will not be giving her a platform to be bigoted. Sex is not a binary, it is bimodal. No one is pretending that they can change their biology except superficially in this regard, and gender, especially when talking about transgender people, is not synonymous with sex, and is also not binary. I know it's too much to ask that Answers in Genesis not be a bunch of homophobes and transphobes, but you'd think they could at least try to not blatantly strawman trans people, who for the most part just want to be allowed to live their lives and exist in public in the way that feels comfortable to them. But also, that's it. That's the last actual claim she makes, then it's just a wrap-up bit. Well, I'm sorry to end this series on this down note, but I guess that's Jen's fault for ending her talking points with such blatant bigotry. If you did like this video, hit like and tell me in the comments. If you didn't, feel free to hit dislike and tell me what the problem was in the comments. Either way, please remember to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you're always notified when I have more content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Philrevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Denny5252, Ellerhan Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Monkey They Them, Sphincter of Doom, Ita V, Strawberry Vein, and Star Runner. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.